Apple introduces its next-gen system, Acclaim powers up its team, and Nintendo wants a piece of the Harry Potter pie. These stories and many more on this month's episode of the Video Game Newsroom Time Machine.
I've been waiting a long time for a chance to say this. Stop the presses.
Requiescat in pace.
Makes him crazy, man. What is a man?
It's me, Mario.
What a mess.
Get over here!
Please save me.
Welcome back to the Video Game Newsroom Time Machine. This month we'll be looking back at the biggest stories in and around the video game industry in May of 1980, 1990, and 2000. As always, I'm Carl, and I'm together with my co-host Peter. Peter, say hi, Peter.
Hi.
Oh, I just did the joke. Oh. Okay.
You took the joke from me. But also, I really appreciate the fact that, as always, you are and stay called Kuras. You just don't change, man. You don't change.
No. People have known me my entire life, and they're like, you haven't grown up, and I haven't seen you since you were 5. Yes, it's just a way of things. But, oh well. Okay, our little banter. Are we done with the banter? Can we get to the meat of the story?
Yeah. Point. We talked so much before actually recording this thing. It's 9 p.m. already, and looking at the stories we have ahead of us, I think we'll be here at
No. Okay, let's get this ball started. So, as always, everybody, we're using the cover dates of magazines and newspapers for our stories. So, obviously, the events themselves happened a little bit earlier, but this at least gives us a framework to build everything around. And you can send comments to us on Twitter at VideoGameNewsR2. Or Instagram, or you can send us an email at the very convenient videogamenewsroomtimemachine@gmail.com. And a couple of announcements we do have to get to. We are still running our Patreon. I know this is probably the worst time in history to be asking anybody for some spare change. But we are running up against the limits of our Libsyn account. We are only allowed so many megabytes upload every month. And so we've had to do the following. I've got right now 3 interviews with video game heavyweights on my hard drive. I've got another one planned for next week. We're recording this on the 13th of May. So because we never know ahead of time exactly how many megabytes we need for the episodes, and the episodes are the most important thing, we've decided to postpone posting interviews until after the monthly episode is done. And then with whatever megabytes we have left over, then we'll fill those up with the interviews that we have. Because we don't want these interviews to just be sitting forever on my hard drive, as I edit them, I will be posting them on our Patreon. And even for the minimum subscription of $1 a month, you'll have access to those. And basically, as soon as we have an episode up and we know how many megabytes are free, we will upload interviews to the regular episode feed, to the podcast feed. But the rate that I'm doing interviews right now, which is about 3 a month, and we're getting 1, sometimes 2 interviews up in addition to an episode every month, without an upgrade to the Libsyn account, that's going to start becoming a bigger and bigger discrepancy between the Patreon episodes and this. The interview that's up right now is Joel Billings.
Who is it?
Joel Billings. He's the founder of SSI, famous company. We talked about them a couple months ago with their first game, Computer Bismarck. Strategy games, later on the D&D license for the gold box titles, and Eye of the Beholder, and Stronghold, and Dragonlance, Dragon Strike, and so on and so forth. Great stories. Danielle Bunton got his first commercial games published there. Just phenomenal guy, great history. How he got into the industry is a story that I had never heard before in that detail. So yeah, 2.5 hour conversation, just really, really pleasant person, fun time and some great anecdotes about the industry and its formative years and how it changed over time. So if you guys can help, I know this is the worst time in the world to ask, but the only reason we're putting this stuff up on Patreon is we literally cannot do this, and there's only so much that we can put in out of pocket ourselves for the Libsyn account. So everything will end up on the feed sooner or later. It's just we need to get like 20 extra bucks a month to be able to upgrade the account without having to take it out of our own pockets. Okay, so links are all down below. And with that being said, we do have to also touch on a couple of corrections. Again, brought to you by the history of how we play. I said that wrong last month. Sorry. 3 things came up after the episode. Number 1, he wants us to know that the GameCube controller is not an utter piece of garbage, and I still say that it is, and that is the end of the discussion, because obviously if he really objected to it, he'd be saying something right now, which he probably is as soon as he hears this, but that's a different ballgame altogether. Second, we had a nice...
A never-ending story, man.
Yeah. The other one was we had this discussion about pricing of the VCS. I quoted a price of $80 in the last episode. That was coming out of a specialty magazine for toy retailers. That was probably the wholesale price. Maybe it was a typo at $180, but that probably wouldn't match up with the prices that were in the 79 toy catalogs. So we're not quite sure what that is. It may have been, I still think it was the wholesale price, but there's still pretty large discrepancy, but over $100 discrepancy between the VCS price and the Intellivision price in going into 1980. But yeah, so not quite sure where that price came from. And finally, I also said that Dungeon Siege had introduced the idea of the skill-based leveling as you did actions in the game, and I was wrong. Elder Scrolls Arena, the first Elder Scrolls game, actually did that a few years earlier. So I stand corrected on that one. I can't believe I messed that one up, but oh well. Okay, those were our corrections for this month. Remember, if you ever catch anything that we said and you're like, that's not right, send us an email about it, and we will talk about it on the show. Okay, are we ready to turn on the time machine, Peter?
I am.
Excellent.
Let's get that thing started, man.
Okay, and we're jumping back to May of 1980.
Personal computers that can swallow a book. 1980.
Games people play.
Welcome to May of 1980. Peter, what's our first story?
Yeah, Coleco reports record first quarter profits.
The first quarter results for a toy company are typically not great, as it's post-Christmas, but Coleco has announced a 41% sales increase and a better than 8-fold gain in earnings for the quarter ended March 31st. Revenues of $40.3 million compared with $28.5 million for the same period in 1979. Net income for the same comparison came to $5.1 million versus just $606,000 the same time this and the last year.
So, me being an economist, let me just ask you a simple question. Was the same time last year an especially bad year?
No, it wasn't an especially bad year. It's just a year before the electronic toys and the expanded older crowd weren't completely captured yet.
Okay. And they caught them in 1979, and in 1980 they had them.
Well, it's they were starting to capture them probably already back in 77, 78, but it's really taking off at this point. And the difference is that these are toys that are appealing not just to smaller children who don't have their own purchasing power, But when you start getting the 16, 17, 18-year-olds, as well as some young adults, college kids and stuff, buying these products, these are all people who have part-time jobs. These are all people who have some kind of spending cash available to them. And so Christmas
And
is
those are
not
the
the
people
end.
that get. Those are also the people that get money for Christmas.
They also get money for Christmas, but that's going to be less of a factor. I really think that this is just a sign that that older crowd is also gaming, and they just have more money. Period. And
I'm
also,
really looking forward to the second quarter earnings to prove your theory.
we will see if we get some second quarter numbers, what happens there. But also, I think that there may have been some pent up demand. There were certain products that didn't make it into the stores in full quantity for Christmas. So it's possible that people are just catching up with it now. So, yeah. These are impressive numbers, and Coleco is going to capitalize on this by going whole hog with consoles and everything else. So no, these are really, really good, solid numbers.
Oh man, it's impressive. I mean, when you look at the rise, this is
yeah,
incredible.
And they had some good products. I mean, and the competitive advertising is probably also helping at this point.
Well, but it's not only Coleco, because also Mattel reports a 22% increase in net sales.
Yep, and Mattel's yearly sales for 1979, including January of 1980, were up 22% over the previous year, mostly due to increased sales of electronic games. And we see it here.
Well,
I mean,
that basically proves his theory.
Yeah, Mattel is just huge. Now, this is for the entire year. So obviously at Christmas time, they're selling a ton of Barbie and whatever else. But 22%.
But they also sold Barbie the year before. So.
Well, I mean, Barbie is the eternal toy sale. I mean,
Right.
you never go wrong with Barbie. But the deal here is that these are much, much more expensive toys.
Yeah.
And so each unit that you're selling, and you're selling them in very large quantities at this point, means a huge boost to your revenue. I mean, and here we're talking about sales revenue. We're not talking profit necessarily, but we are talking sales revenue. And that move into higher priced items is having an effect on the revenue numbers.
Right. Do you have any net income numbers of Mattel?
I didn't find any net income numbers at this point. I could have done a deeper dive. Unfortunately, because of COVID, I don't really have access to the same databases I had when I was still on campus, and I haven't bothered to hook up the VPN to be able to access Lexus. So unfortunately this month we are only going through New York Times and LA Times archives, as well as some other reports online. So no, I didn't have the full Mattel reports. I probably could have pulled their annual reports, but those were a few extra hours of my life I did not have to spare.
No, it's okay. Save them for later.
Exactly. Trust me, there are plenty of other good stories that I did do some very deep dives on, so don't worry about it. It's coming. Okay.
Yeah, speaking about things that are coming, as if it was planned, the French are planning to launch terminals.
The iconic Minitel terminals are on the horizon for French consumers. While most countries were simply waxing poetically about online services for the masses, the French Postal Service was doing something about it. A replacement for phone books, the system would become ubiquitous throughout France, with terminals being given to households for free and turn a hefty profit for the Postal Service as paid services such as games, news, and online shopping would flourish. The system was finally discontinued in 2012. So, have you ever heard of the Minitel?
Yeah, I was about to tell you. I mean, I looked it up just before we were recording this podcast, but earlier I haven't heard of it, and I was so startled when I saw that this thing continued to live until 2012.
Oh,
This
yeah.
is incredible, man.
Well, I mean, just think about it. It was a tiny little terminal. It cost you nothing. And a lot of these services, text-based services, they don't need a lot of graphics or anything as long as you could do it. I mean, do you really need a bunch of little graphics when you're booking a vacation? No. You just need the raw data, and there you go. And when it's free and the system is there, it is very, very difficult to upgrade. And so the fact that this existed well into the internet age is just a sign of, if it ain't broke, don't fix it.
Don't fix it, man. Are the 2012 versions a considerable upgrade compared to the 1980s version, or were they basically using the same technology over those 32 years?
I'm not an expert on this, and if we have any French listeners who would love to give us a deep dive on this, the way Quarterpass did for the FCC, I will gladly invite somebody with deep knowledge on this to come on and do an extra episode, because I've personally never used a Minitel system, but as far as I can tell, there were virtually no significant hardware upgrades over the decades. So it was essentially the same software. They probably upgraded the hardware chips and so forth, the internal circuitry, but I don't believe that the software was in any way, it got any major revisions over the decades. So,
This is fascinating. Do you know what kind of technology was inside those things?
There's a Wikipedia article on it that gives you all the breakdown, and there also was an episode, I believe Nostalgia Nerd is the YouTuber. I can add a link to his breakdown of it, where it's an English guy who got a Minitel system, and there are still some people running their own Minitel servers. So sort of the hobbyists are keeping it going. And he bought one just to hook it up and try it out. So it was a color screen. The closest analogy I can give, at least for European listeners, is the old teletext system. It looked very, very similar to that. But teletext was basically just like HTML pages that you could call up, stacked HTML pages. But this was actually more interactive because it also had the keyboard, and you could put in information.
Okay.
Yeah. So
cool.
and way ahead of its time. I mean, everybody else is just sort of floundering, and these guys just built an entire system. We will see that there were several attempts to try to export this system to other places, and just like the teletext services that we've talked about over the last 12 months, several attempts to bring that to the United States, they pretty much all falter because the telephone system, the television systems there's no cohesive service provider in the United States. Not like in Europe, where you have government-run television stations being the predominant stations. In the U.S., it's private stations, and they just don't cooperate with one another. And with this is probably coming at a time when in France and Germany, you have no real home computer market. And we've already had the Trinity in the U.S., meaning that there's already a not deep, but already a significant enough penetration of home computers that the people who would be interested in a Minitel system have probably already bought a home computer. And the home computer revolution by the end of 1980 is going to be in full swing with the announcement of the VIC-20. So it's going to be one of those situations where the Minitel would be coming too late to the United States to have penetration, unless they got the phone company to back it, and AT&T is about to be broken up. So it's just, there was never a chance of this becoming a success, something launchable in the U.S.
Right, but I mean, I'm just startled that they actually gave it away for free, and the fact that this thing ran for 32 years surely shows that they turned in a hefty profit. Whoa.
Oh, a massive profit. Massive profit. Well, just think about it. They had the perfect billing system. It was your bill, your telephone bill.
Yeah.
So in a time before widespread use of credit cards and stuff, you already had the billing system. It was just like a cell phone nowadays, where you basically pay for the cell phone with your monthly plan. Here it was basically pay as you go. Each service, it was microtransactions before the phrase microtransactions came around. So I'd love to do a deep dive on Minitel. It's something that the first time I heard about it in the mid 80s, I read about it in a newspaper article. I was fascinated by the concept of it, but I never had the opportunity to actually interact with one. So go figure. Okay, but leaving the French behind.
And going over the Great Sea. Pizza Time Theater sues Topeka in Management, Inc.
Topeka.
Yeah.
Yeah, Topeka. Yeah, Indian name. It's probably has no association whatsoever with the way the original word was pronounced, but oh well. Yeah, we say Topeka. So, Nolan Bushnell's Pizza Time Theater, aka Chuck E. Cheese, has sued Topeka Inn Management Incorporated for breach of contract. Topeka had signed a deal to develop 200 Chuck E. Cheese locations over the coming years, with Pizza Time already having delivered materials including animatronics. Topeka backed out of the deal and would launch their own rival chain, Showbiz Pizza. Ultimately, they would settle out of court, and Pizza Time would get a chunk of Showbiz's profits for a period of 14 years. Granted, Pizza Time would go belly up in 1984 and subsequently be acquired by Showbiz, which would rebrand itself CEC Incorporated, aka Chuck E. Cheese, and ultimately drop the Showbiz identity altogether. So, yeah, this is a fun thing. I got a link to a Google Books link in the show notes because, the story here goes that these guys stabbed Nolan Bushnell in the back. They got all the tech, they got all the layouts, and then they just created their own thing with animatronics, singing and dancing while people ate pizza and played arcade games. And unfortunately, Pizza Time Theater, Chuck E. Cheese, goes belly up before they can get their full 14 years of profits out of it. And Showbiz happens to be in a better situation at the time, and they take over Chuck E. Cheese.
So, two questions. First, do you think Pizza Time would have survived if Topeka Inn Management Inc. stood true to their contract?
The collapse of Pizza Time is largely related, and we will talk about it when we get there. In my opinion, from what I know so far, and obviously as we go through the story, and that's one of the reasons we do the show in this format, is that I like the idea of experiencing headline by headline the evolution of a business. That's why we've talked so much about Pizza Time, the different steps and expansions and so forth, so that you get a better idea of what's going to happen. My understanding so far is that Pizza Time collapses because they stretch themselves too far, the arcade crash happens, and they can't really pivot fast enough. And they don't reinvent themselves fast enough to be able to to survive that lull in the market. And Showbiz is a little bit better there. Topeka Inn Management is a company that, as far as I've been able to tell, was running inns. They were running like hotels and stuff. And they also had restaurants. And so they were already more familiar with the food side of things, with managing personnel. So a lot of the stuff that Nolan Bushnell and Joe Keenan the two guys running Chuck E. Cheese, they were good at the arcade stuff. They weren't necessarily that well versed in the food side of stuff. And I think that had they had the money coming in from Topeka, back to your question, had they had the money from Topeka, which would have been much better run, and they probably could have learned a thing or two from the way Topeka was running their stores, then they probably would have been in a better situation come 1984 had they learned those lessons before 1984, before the crash. Had they been learning from Topeka in 1980, 81, 82, and adapting their other stores to those methods, then yeah, those 200 Topeka-owned stores probably would have been a profit center backbone for the mother company.
Okay.
But at the same time, I think that Topeka probably would have remained such a powerful player, and if it had really been successful, they probably would have expanded beyond the 200 Chuck E. Cheeses, that Topeka just taking over the company at some point or another would have been inevitable. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah.
They would have just been such a large franchisee that it wouldn't have made sense for them not to just take over the whole thing. The fact that they got to take it over in bankruptcy sale was just cheaper than anything else.
Yeah, sure.
Yeah.
Well, this also answers my second question. That would have been what Topeka made better than Pizza Time Theater. Just to follow up, was the food really that bad at Pizza Time Theater?
I mean, as a kid, I remember it was pizza. I know it wasn't good pizza because I knew what good pizza tasted like. But you weren't going there for the pizza. You were going there for the entertainment, and the pizza just happened to be the cheapest thing that they could serve you that wouldn't require dishes and stuff like that to be taken care of.
Oh, Lord, really? Plastic stuff?
I don't think it was probably it wasn't disposable plastic in my memory, but that's fuzzy. The whole point of going there was to watch the animatronics and to play games. Okay. That was really the point. And if you also had the meal, you would stay there longer.
Right, and you can entertain the parents.
Exactly, yeah. And the parents. I mean, when I went there as a kid, we're talking 83, 84, 82 maybe for the first time. I'd have to check again when the store near my place opened. Anybody out there know when the South Center, Washington, the one outside of Seattle, that Chuck E. Cheese opened up? You can drop it in the show notes or so, or send us an email. So I went there, and that was our Chuck E. Cheese. And the things I remember was you had the one big room with all the characters, and we never went in that room. And there were 2 or 3 side rooms where you had, one was a hippo ballerina, and one was this lion dressed as Elvis Presley, and he sang Elvis Presley songs when you threw a quarter into a little box on the side. And my dad is a huge Elvis Presley fan, so we always had to sit in that room. We always had to listen to a couple of Elvis songs. And and I would go and play skee-ball primarily. I didn't actually get interested in the video games until after Dragon Slayer showed up. So, I was a skee-ball player. What can I say? I enjoyed the game. Plus, you got tickets, and you could try to get more coins that way. So, in my little head, I was always thinking, if I'm good enough, if I play 2 quarters worth of games, 2 tokens worth of games. If I'm really lucky, I can get enough tickets for an extra quarter, or, maybe if I put 3 in, I'll have enough to get the extra quarter. So, I'm not doubling my money basically, but what I am doing is getting more bang for my $1 or $2 that my parents would give me to go play games.
Okay. So the system worked on you.
Oh, the system definitely worked for me. And then I remember going back there one day, and they had gotten rid of that system, and you could only trade in the tickets for garbage for some little plastic toy or something, and that's when I was done with skee ball.
That's it.
That was the end of my skee ball obsession, and suddenly Chuck E. Cheese was not that important to me anymore, because I wasn't going to spend 2 tokens to play Dragon's Lair and lose after 5 seconds. So, yeah. C'est la vie. Okay, but staying in the arcades.
Yes, Midway once against copying Galaxian.
After the copious copycats showed their wares at the ATE show in London, as we reported 2 months ago, Midway has now taken out a full-page ad warning those that would copy the game they licensed from Namco to let it be, because they ain't gonna take it. One case that would come out of this was against Bandai for their handheld Galaxian game. And yes, so
this is really a time of super aggressive marketing, isn't it? I mean, if you take out an ad page, and I think we had those kind of stories a couple of times earlier, you take out an entire ad page, which surely wasn't cheap, just to say, guys, back the F off.
Yeah, but I mean, it kind of makes sense to try this because the places these ads are showing up in are trade magazines. So they're showing up in like Replay magazine, which is targeted primarily at distributors and operators of video arcades. So what this is really telling, it's not talking to the copycat makers. It's talking to these distributors. And we saw this when we talked about how Nintendo, I believe it was last month or a month before that, Nintendo was going after, or Nintendo or Atari was suing operators for games that they're not supposed to be using. The idea here is to prevent people from even buying the copycat machine. Because if the operators and distributors are buying them, then you're going to have these problems. And yeah.
So as an operator, it was my my duty to check whether or not the game that is sold to me through one of those catalogs is actually a game that the guy who sells it to me is allowed to sell to me. So I'm responsible for the setup, so I'm responsible for keeping all the laws in order.
Well, at this point in time, you have to remember that copyright law on video games is still in its infancy. We're going to see in a couple of years when we get to Pac-Man that there's some very big lawsuits that finally define what is a copyrightable idea in a video game. The Casey Munchkin suit is really the one that's going to solidify the legal idea here of how much of the idea is copyrightable. At this point, remember, copyright up until now has never had to apply itself to something that's interactive. Okay? So if you were copywriting a board game, you copied the layout of the board. You copied the instructions. But you didn't have to copy the movements of the players around the board. For example, if you copyrighted Monopoly, you didn't have to copyright that the little doggy moves 3 squares forward. But now, when you're dealing with a screen, are the images on the screen copyrightable? Because every player is going to have a completely different game of Pac-Man. Every player is going to have a not completely different, but they're never going to have the exact same series of images in a row. And so there's going to be some confusion in these early days in the courts as to whether or not copyright law needs to be completely rewritten. Can you even apply the traditional copyright law that applies to film and television here, or do you need to write something new? And what do you do if somebody isn't copying the source code, but they're just writing a new game that works just the same? And how do you even look at the source code? Well, and that's the thing. If you copy the game design, is the game design copyrightable? At what point do you say shooting aliens is a copyrightable idea?
Well, if you say that, then you basically have no games at all because, I mean,
Well, and
the bad guy
well, and
surviving.
that's the thing. Galaxian is very, very much like Space Invaders, with a
Yeah.
couple of twists. It's still the ship at the bottom. Now it's not on the ground shooting upward. There's no longer the shields, the permanent shields in the front, but the patterns for the enemies are more complex. And so the question is this a violation of Space Invaders? What is protectable? What's not protectable, and so forth? And all of this is still open, and we will get legal tests for how this works, but that's going to come later. We're still a couple years out from that.
Okay.
And so this is why they're saying, hey, we'll take legal action if you're copying Galaxian. And
we don't know whether or not we have a case, but we will try.
exactly. And the big case here is against Bandai for their handheld Galaxian game. So it's little bouncy lights, and it tries to mimic Galaxian. And their biggest problem is they called it Galaxian.
Oh, really?
It's called Galaxian. There's a link in the show notes. You can take a look at the machine. They called it Galaxian, which, I mean, if they called it Galaxy Game or whatever else, it would have been generic enough, even though Galaxy Game was also a game. But, okay. Except anything. Just put Galaxy on it as opposed to Galaxian, spelled the same way. So, yeah. I mean, we see here a pattern of people realizing, hey, wait, we've got something here. And I think, and I don't have anything to back this up, but it's just my gut feeling, they also see it as not just the arcade game, but they also see on the horizon the potential of home ports.
Yeah.
And the value of those home ports, be it in handheld format, be it in cartridge format, there's going to be more revenue streams. And if Space Invaders is anything to go by, T-shirts, and Space Invaders then also spun off pinball machine and so on and so forth, there's more money to be made off of these games than just the arcade machine. And so nobody really knows what the next hit will be, but they all know that if you do have the hit, you don't want to have to give up the hit.
Right.
Yeah. So, oh well, that's the fun stuff. And sticking with imported games from Japan that are handheld.
Yeah. Migo's Timeout series to be shown at the CES.
Migo, the toy maker famous for the world's famous superhero action figure line, has taken out a one-page ad for their new Time Out line of LCD display games with built-in clocks. The line, which Migo would only sell for a short while, are actually rebranded Game & Watch titles from Nintendo. Nintendo partnered with Migo due to their extensive distribution network and would sever ties once they established Nintendo of America.
Used to, goodbye.
So
it was really a time where everyone wanted to go into the electronic games business, wasn't it?
It was, but you have to remember, Nintendo was already a famous toy maker in Japan was already in the arcades at this point. So they had already released some arcade titles. Granted, they were basically knockoffs of other people's games. But
I'm talking about Migo, the guys who make action figures.
Oh, yeah, Migo, they needed to get into it. Yeah, you're right. I mean, why wouldn't you? And the fact that they managed to get this Game & Watch idea is really kind of silly that they didn't somehow lock down the tech. But it also shows the problem that a lot of these American companies are going to have just by licensing as opposed to developing their own designs. Sooner or later, everybody else is going to be just bringing the stuff to the U.S. themselves. And if you haven't developed the capacity to design, in the meantime, you're going to be left out of the game. And this is where the companies that move from the arcade to consoles or whatever, they're going to have a leg up on the Japanese competition, at least at first. But yeah, the Game & Watch, have you ever played a Game & Watch?
No.
Oh, okay. Now, Game & Watch is legendary. If you're listening to this podcast, you're shaking your head being like, how can you not know Game & Watch? But Game & Watch was a 2-screen system, primarily. I believe there were 1 or 2 of them that were only 1 screen to begin with. LCD games, so the little black characters running back and forth and stuff. And it was also the system, they were designed by Gunpei Yokoi, the guy who would later do the Game Boy. And it was also the first appearance of the cross-shaped control, the D-pad, directional pad, the cross-shaped one that Nintendo has used on every system since.
Well, not only Nintendo.
Actually, yes. You will not find a cross-shaped controller on any other system.
What?
Think about it. The PlayStation has little arrows pointing inward. The Xbox has rounded edges.
Okay, you mean the exact cross figure. Yeah.
Exactly. They have a patent on it, or a copyright, I believe, even. I'd have to look that up. But yeah, nobody's allowed to use it except them. Yeah. And so it's like their thing. And it starts here on the Game & Watch.
I mean, if Nintendo has patented the D-pad in its Nintendo form, why does, for instance, PlayStation not patent the dual analog sticks? You know, can you just say no one can use sticks on a controller that there are 2 of?
Well, the problem is that those dual controller stick concept goes all the way back to Robotron, which I believe is 1982, 81, 82, designed. So that's an old thing from the arcades. And before that, you had dual controllers on tanks. That's how you control tanks.
Okay.
So yeah, that wouldn't have flown. It's not a unique new idea.
Okay.
But nobody had ever used a controller like this to control a video game, because up until now, video games were always joystick based. And so joystick or a keyboard, but nobody had ever done this. And it made sense for the Game & Watch concept.
Yeah.
And so, yeah. And the Game & Watch, those are such cult hits. I mean, there's even been a series of Game & Watch ports to the Commodore 64 recently. So somebody's been recreating the old Game & Watch games for the Commodore 64 home computer. And I've been playing those, and they're absolutely awesome. So I'll try to include links to them in the show notes. Okay. But
let's move on, man. Yes, the Apple debuts the Apple III.
Apple's attempt to follow up the Apple II with a more business-friendly machine, it had upper and lowercase letters, would be a bit of a failure, with the first batch of machines being unstable and requiring a recall. By the time the system was relaunched in November of 1981, IBM will have already introduced their PC, and the business world will no longer be looking to 8-bit machines. So, yes, the failed Apple III.
Right. So, but this was the first Apple which had upper and lowercase letters?
Oh, yeah. And this is a huge problem basically for all 3 of the Trinity machines that were introduced in 77. That to be able to do upper and lowercase meant essentially doubling the amount of space that you were reserving for the letter characters in your RAM. In your ROM, sorry. And so there were a bunch of workarounds to get those in the machine, but they weren't inherently built in just because you couldn't fit them in there. And you have to remember, these original machines don't have a GUI. They don't have an operating system as we know it. They would just have BASIC. So the idea here was that you would have to program your own programs anyway Nobody was really thinking of doing something like a word processor on these machines.
Right. So why do you need any lowercase letters?
Exactly. Basic programming language doesn't need it, so why would you?
Yeah. So
Yeah.
what did they use? Did they use upper or lowercase letters?
Uppercase letters for everything. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. And like I said, later on there are solutions and workarounds for this. And going through the old magazines, I found all sorts of add-ons and patches and programs to add this stuff. But the real problem is on the original machines that you don't really have the 80-column display. So you don't have a number of characters on the screen equivalent to a typewriter. And this makes these early machines very, very difficult to use. I believe the Trash 80 is the only one that gets close to this. And please don't quote me on the text on this. I'd have to look it up. I believe the Trash 80 was capable of a 80-column display, but don't quote me on that. But the PET wasn't capable of it out of the box, and I know the Apple wasn't either. So, and this is going to be something that's going to plague the 8-bit machines for quite a while, and IBM's 16-bit architecture is going to have that as a built-in feature because they're designing it for the business world.
Yeah, and also you have enough processing and power and enough storage space to have both kind of letters.
Well, also, the IBM is so expensive when it comes out compared to the other machines.
Yeah, it's just
the other machines could do it too if you added enough extra cost. But IBM has the clout and is targeting a professional crowd with their machine.
Cool. All right, let's move on, I'd say.
Yes, definitely.
Yeah, Avalon Hill enters the computer game market.
Strategy game giant Avalon Hill has announced the creation of its own computer game development subsidiary. The new company, Microcomputer Games Inc., will last into the mid-'80s and port many of Avalon Hill's games to home computers. Avalon Hill would later license some of its board games out or develop them with a variety of outside teams. Now, have you ever heard of Avalon Hill?
Whenever you ask that question, the answer usually is
No, you haven't. Okay, Avalon Hill, I believe it still exists as a brand name. They were basically the king of the mountain as far as high-end, super complex board game strategy titles was concerned. So these were, you bought this giant box with 1,000 pieces in it, and you could recreate battles and stuff. They were the gold standard for strategy gamers on table. And this came out in our interview with the founder of SSI. He had originally approached Avalon Hill with his game Computer Bismarck, saying, hey guys, this is very similar to the types of games you guys are making. They even had a game called Bismarck at the time, which recreated the same historic battle. And he said, hey, why don't you guys publish it? And they told him no. And it was probably because they were planning their own company. Unfortunately, the games that they release are never really at the same level as the ones SSI releases. This is partially, I think, just due to the fact that they're not really approaching this from the standpoint of what would make a good computer game, but they're just trying to port what's in the board game. And Joel actually in our interview, and this is not just me promoting the interview, but that's a great interview.
It also is you promoting the interview.
Yes. But he made a great point because he had been an avid war gamer, and he had been able to do a session with an outside judge where they basically two teams looking at the board without knowing what the other team was doing, creating a fog of war effect, which is the holy grail of board games. It's almost impossible to do a board game with Fog of War where the other people don't know what you're doing.
Yeah.
And he saw that as the advantage the computer could give. That you could finally have a proper war game with the Fog of War attribute if you did it on the computer, because the opponent is the computer. You can hide the information from the computer and hide the information from the player, and the computer still knows where the information is. You just isolate it from the AI routine.
Yeah, I don't believe that actually is done properly.
Well, I mean, obviously, you're going to fumble that a little bit. You're going to smudge that just a little bit in order to create different difficulty levels and whatnot. But in theory, that's what you could do. You could have the computer play by the same rules as the player and just not know where the player is. And that is one of the things that marks the SSI titles, especially in the early days, separates them from the board game experience. And it's something I don't think Avalon Hill ever really understood. And they were too beholden to their board game roots. And then they just didn't have the best programmer talent necessarily working on the titles. So this is why Avalon Hill gets out of it relatively quickly.
Yeah.
Yeah. But they're a huge player, and the fact that they're announcing that they're going to get into this tells us how important this home computer market is becoming.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Well, especially on the field of strategy games. I mean, where else can you play a good strategy game if not at home?
That, and also remember, if the audience that you're appealing to are programmers, where, let's face it, programming is just problem solving and strategizing and thinking ahead 10 moves, what's going to happen with the next routine and stuff. There's a lot of overlap between programmers and strategy players at this point.
Yeah.
Yeah. And finally.
So, Avalon Hill enters the computer game market, and also Katie. Dude. Like
I know.
For the next one. Anyhow, yeah, Katie goes into the computer.
Creative Computing Press is promoting a new book explaining to kids how computers work. Now, this little artifact can be read online at archive.org. The link is in the description. And I do recommend it because it tries to explain basic programming down to the metal. So it's computer operations in a way that seems alien in our GUI world. This thing really is an archive of the past, because you would never try to explain how a computer works to a kid nowadays this way. This really is trying to explain basically the on and off components of binary inside of a CPU.
Cool.
And it's kind of cool in a way. It's sort of like an Alice in Wonderland. She flies into the computer, and the different parts of the computer have personalities. They're represented by different characters and stuff. It's definitely worth a look at just because of the way it does it, and I was really happy to find it online in its complete form, so I thought it was definitely worth mentioning here on the show.
Sounds pretty cool.
It is. I definitely recommend. I mean, you can read through it in a couple of minutes, but it's fascinating to really understand. And like I was saying earlier, it's everybody at this point. You buy a computer to program it yourself. You're not buying it to just run your pre-purchased software, and that this book kind of exemplifies that very, very big difference. So, a blast from the past. Okay, I believe that's it for May of 1980. Let's turn on the time machine and jump forward to May of 1990.
Today we have a ton of tips for some of the hottest titles around.
Mario Brothers 3.
You can't do that on an 8-bit system.
Welcome to May of 1990. Peter, what's our first story?
Core Design becomes its own publisher.
After developing classic titles like Switchblade, Rick Dangerous, and Monty Python's Flying Circus for a variety of publishers, Core Design has decided to become their own publisher. Their first title, with the working title of Derelict, should be out later in the year with future plans still undecided. So, Core Design, what titles come to mind when you think Core Design?
Oh, Core Design. Well, Core Design, of course, is a name well known to me. Absolutely. I mean, it was a British company, and they had their company seat was in Derby, I think, in England. Am I right? And
Yes.
I immediately have to think of, well, amongst others, of Tomb Raider.
Very, very
Which
good.
they somehow had a share in, especially Tomb Raider Angel of Darkness, which, although it was a Tomb Raider title, was of really, really bad quality. Now I really remember this. I mean, I'm butchering the Wikipedia page right now, by the way.
Yeah.
Tomb Raider entry, thanks. But Tomb Raider Angel of Darkness, yeah, that was crap.
Yes, you are correct that Tomb Raider Angel of Darkness was garbage. But yes, Core Design does go on to create Tomb Raider. But back in the 90s, late 80s, early 90s, they were one of the top UK development studios. They did a ton of really good games. The game Derelict that I just mentioned becomes Corporation, which was a first-person shooter, not using ray tracing like Wolfenstein, but using vector graphics, of solid vector graphics. Corporation, yeah. The idea was, if I remember the plot, it was your typical corporation does evil things, genetic manipulation or whatever, and now the monsters running through the building, and you have to shoot them down and find some computers or something. It had some role-playing elements to it where you had to outfit your character and you had stats and things like that. So it was still more of a role-playing game. And I mean, there's no textures on the walls. It's all just shades of gray and solid colors for the ceilings and whatnot. But at the time, you didn't really have a lot in the way of first-person games, let alone first-person action games. Yeah. So it was a big deal when it came out. Mm-hmm. And yeah, and later on they would go on to do a bunch of other big games. They were big on the on the Mega CD, on the Sega CD. They did a bunch of conversions. They were pretty closely aligned with Sega for quite a while, so Sega got a lot of their ports. And this is also why Tomb Raider was first released on the Sega Saturn, the first Tomb Raider. Before it was ported to the PlayStation, it was pretty much that loyalty that they felt towards Sega because Sega helped them out early on by letting them develop for the system, whereas most European publishers were not in the console field that early. And yeah, so Core, massive history. It's just a little sad that at some point they just kind of got caught up in Tomb Raider-itis and too many Tomb Raider releases to the point where it just, died, and and the company just basically was dissolved for all intents and purposes.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
Yeah.
Well, all companies die eventually.
We still have a few years before we get to that point, but
Right.
we have to have that conversation about core. But yeah, this is them breaking out and becoming publishers. So hey,
Right. So
cool.
they're born.
Yep.
Speaking of about things that are being born, Don Bluth.
Bluth.
Don Bluth to produce its own games.
Don Bluth, legendary animator and creator of classics such as Dragon's Lair and Space Ace, has apparently seen the success of ReadySoft's ports of the old Laserdisc games and has decided to open their own internal development studio to bring new animated games to the public. Titles announced in this month's The One are Dragon's Lair The Legend, Space Ace 2 Borf's Revenge, and The Sea Beast and Barnacle Bill. Now, ReadySoft would end up developing and releasing Space Ace 2. Dragon's Lair The Legend would be a Game Boy title by Elite Systems, actually just a reskin of an old Spectrum platformer, and The Sea Beast was a canceled Laserdisc title that was interrupted by the production of the movie An American Tail. So,
what happened?
Well, what happened was, okay, the Don Bluth and video game story goes all the way back. Like I said, I didn't care about video games as a kid until I saw Dragon's Lair. And the Laserdisc games, I mean, we've talked about them in the show before, not really interactive games as we know them today, but at the time it really pushed the Laserdisc technology and the branching path structure that you could build on it as far as you could with a traditional Laserdisc. And so when those old animated games got ported to 16-bit computers, there had been attempts to port them back in the 8-bit days. But when they got ported on, they used a really cool data streaming technology. So it was streaming the animation data from floppy disks. So you got maybe a quarter to half of the Laserdisc game on like 14 floppies. It wasn't that many. It was more like 5, but still a lot of disk access because it was constantly loading it. But you got full motion, a full screen video. So it would be a background image and the animated elements were reduced to like 4 or 5 colors, but that still looked kind of like animation because that's how animation works. And it played just like the arcade, so it was just a timing exercise.
Yeah.
But those games made a ton of money because if you were an owner of an Atari ST or an Amiga, it was a great way to show off your machine. And
and how fast you can change floppy disks.
basically. I mean, I loved them, and they sold for buco bucks. And so it was one of those situations where for a hot minute, this was the hot item. That would die off fairly quickly as people figured out there's not much of a game here. And so this idea that they were going to now produce their own games sounded like they were going to have, programmers on staff and blah, 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 blah. The reality is it was more of them just licensing and trying to take a little bit more control over it. The reality is ReadySoft, which I believe was a Canadian company, they were still going to be managing the video streaming stuff. And the Dragon's Lair The Legend was just a really, really pathetic reskin of a game about a theme park. So the game made no sense in the context of Dragon's Lair. The level design made no sense. It was just a cheap cash-in from Elite Systems. The one that really surprised me here, though, and I had never heard about the Sea Beast and Barnacle Bill before. And I thought I was a pretty big Don Bluth fan. But yeah, this was going to be basically their third Laserdisc game. They had Dragon's Lair and then Space Ace. This was supposed to be the next one. And he only took the Dragon's Lair gig because he needed money after a bunch of other projects had fallen through. It was like a quick stopgap to keep the studio open. And when Steven Spielberg asked Don Bluth to produce An American Tail, that's the one about the little Russian Jewish mouse who immigrates with his family to America. It's a beautiful movie, and it's Don Bluth animation at its finest. Then they just basically said, okay, we don't need to do this video game thing anymore. It's just going to get in the way. Let's make this movie. And so there's a little bit of production art. There's a mock-up of a poster, but that's pretty much all apparently that exists of that game. Yeah. And so, yeah, I'm a big Don Bluth fan. Dragon's Lair was my gateway to video games, so anything involved with him is going to catch my fancy.
Not bad.
No.
Bad.
Okay.
Okay. Then let's move on, man, because we have way more topics ahead.
Oh, yes.
Data East makes Joe Keenan their new president.
Arcade heavyweight Data East, famous for classics such as Burger Time and RoboCop, has named industry veteran Joe Keenan, formerly of Atari and Chuck E. Cheese, to head up their U.S. arcade operations. Gene Lipkin, another Atari alum, would also join the company. Keenan and Lipkin would stay on at Data East for 2 years, but have frequent clashes with the Japanese headquarters as their attempts to bring in more Western content to the company met heavy opposition.
Oh, Lord.
Oh, yeah.
So this is the classic case of I want to get in a manager who knows the market, but I don't want to do anything that the manager recommends to make products that actually fit the market.
Pretty much. How to put it nicely? I mean, Data East is running into a problem right here because Data East was starting to lose a lot of ground in the arcade business. They had some big hits around this time, Sly Spy being one of them. But they're starting to lose their grip on what the market wants and doesn't want. I feel, at least from their output, and the idea of bringing in Joe Keenan, and he brings in several people, not just Gene Lipkin from Atari, and they're trying to reinvent Data East's US. And I think what they really just wanted was they wanted somebody with deep connections to the industry to help sell the Japanese product. And Joe Keenan and his team were far more interested in trying to develop product for the US. And that just was not going to work. So ultimately, after 2 tumultuous years, they part ways again. But Data East is starting to lose its way here a little bit. Their big, huge hits are going to be far and few between after going into the 90s. And once the one-on-one fighting game craze starts, they don't really have any heavy hitters in that market. That's going to be owned by SNK, Capcom, Midway, but Data East is going to have a couple entries, but it's not really going to be a player.
Yeah,
so
this is something you really shouldn't do if you want to get into. If you get a manager who wants to develop stuff, you should let him develop. Or not, or you shouldn't hire him. Exactly.
And it was just a bad fit. And unfortunately, it also cost them 2 years. I mean, that's the sad part.
Right.
But, oh well.
Well, let's head on to more positive news. Acclaim triples previous year's revenue.
If there was ever a sign of just how hot the console gaming space had become by 1990, the fact that Acclaim was tripling its revenue in just 1 year should tell you all you need to know. And they were just beginning to launch games on the Game Boy. So, I mean, we talked 2 months ago about how they had purchased LJN. This is a company on the rise, and they're rising fast. And so fast, in fact, Sorry, building my own transitions now.
So fast, in fact, that they're cutting a deal with Williams.
Acclaim is running hot after its acquisition of LJN 2 months ago. Now they have signed a right of first refusal deal with WMS Industries, parent company of Williams, Midway, and Bally, giving them first dibs on console ports of the company's arcade output. This deal will assure their output now that they have 5 additional NES cart slots to fill on their release schedule. The deal would last until 1994, when WMS would move to develop their own console games in-house, leading to such gems as Mortal Kombat Mythologies Sub-Zero. And yes, that's sarcasm. Okay.
Anyhow, but those guys really seem to be on cocaine, because they are also building a power team.
Yes, in a pre-Sillywood mash-up of video games and traditional media, Acclaim has co-produced a TV show called The Power Team, which joins 4 characters from games it published: a cop from the super-violent Narc, a basketball player from Arch Rivals, a barbarian from Wizards and Warriors, a self-driving Bigfoot monster truck, and an anthropomorphic punk tomato. Yes, kids, cocaine is a wonderful drug. So, okay, we got 3 big Acclaim headlines.
Yeah.
They don't know what to do with all the money they've got.
Yeah. The last story surely shows that.
They're desperately trying to establish an identity for their company. But already, well, I mean, here already you've got, other than Wizards and Warriors and whatever the tomato game was, Narc is a port of a Williams arcade machine. Arch Rivals was a port of an arcade machine. Bigfoot is a licensed truck. It's one of those monster trucks that crushes cars and stuff. Which means that 3 of the 5 properties that they built this show around didn't really belong to them. That if they wanted to continue to develop, they needed to do something. This right of first refusal deal with WMS Industries, which had this been in an era when Nintendo wasn't limiting a publisher to 5 carts per year, probably would have been an output deal. Would have been a deal, hey, Williams will buy all of your arcade games. But because they're limited to 5 games per year, if Williams makes 6 games, they can't port the 6th one, because they can't do anything with it because there's no other console to port it to.
Right.
And, I mean, this is all happening sort of simultaneously with Sega releasing the Genesis. Obviously, you know, how many months back this deal actually happened before it gets reported on is probably up in the air a little bit. And whether or not Sega's machine will be around in 6 months, or the TurboGrafx will be around, or whether or not it pays off to do it, is hard to say. But the fact that they now have this deal, and it's going to run for quite a while, Acclaim basically becomes synonymous with home versions of Williams, Midway, and Bally games, and is going to lead to their biggest hit, which is going to be Mortal Kombat. So Acclaim is going to do all the home ports of the Mortal Kombat games, at least 1, 2, 3, and I believe 4. It's after 4 that, or maybe, no, 4... I can't remember if 4 was also an Acclaim title. I'd have to look that up. But at least 1, 2, and 3, and Ultimate 3 are all Acclaim titles, and they make a huge bundle of money off of it. They've got the whole Immortal Monday and stuff, and a little bit more about that when my Joe Morici interview gets posted, former head of Capcom USA. So, yeah, our marketing manager, I should say, of Capcom USA, he talks about that extensively. So, yeah, it's one of those situations where Acclaim wasn't always the best quality games in the world, but if you wanted the arcade game at home, they were the company bringing it to you.
Okay.
Yeah, and the Power Team cartoon does not last long. If anybody wants to see just how bad this is, there's a link to the intro down in the show notes. I seriously recommend at least having a look at it at least once, because it's, well, Peter, what did you think? You watched it right before we started recording.
You know, if I was super wasted, that would have been good. Sadly, I'm sticking to apple juice this evening, so, well.
Yeah.
What I didn't figure out from the trailer is that the truck actually is a self-driving, more or less sentient truck, so this makes it actually pretty cool. What I do not get is that those guys are shooting around, so how does the barbarian stand any chances? But, well, it's an idea, and someone surely put a whole lot of mind power into it, and this needs to be appreciated in some way or another.
I don't know how much mind power they put into it, but yeah, it's just disastrously bad.
Well, or at least someone paid a buttload of money to get this on this level of being high that you can think of that. So also that, kudos.
Yeah, something like that. Oh well. Okay, let's stick to the arcades for just a little bit
Yes. Let's get back to serious business. F-15 Strike Eagle is heading to arcades.
Ports of arcade games to the home were commonplace back in the day, but a home game heading to the arcade, while not unheard of, was very rare. F-15 Strike Eagle, Microprose's flagship series, is about to make this rare jump. Computer and Video Games magazine in the UK gives the game a massive 2-page spread. While the game will be a technical marvel, it will sadly underperform and have some pretty devastating effects on the company. You can hear more about it, of course, in our interview with Wild Bill Steely.
Yeah.
Again, a little bit of a promo right there, but deservedly so. Deservedly so. This game really is the beginning of the downfall of the company in many, many ways.
Dude, but you know what? I recently read that the Phoenix is rising out of the ashes and Microprose is gonna be back.
Microprose is coming back. Yeah, they just announced a few days ago 3 new titles, and well, I already knew the 3 titles were coming. We couldn't mention it in the Wild Bill interview. He asked me to hold off on that, but yeah, he's really excited about the company coming back and the way it's coming back, and the enthusiasm of the new head of the company, who's basically an old school fan. I mean, it's good to see them come back. It's good to see that there is a place in the market for that kind of simulation.
Well, we don't know that yet.
Well, I think there is, because with online distribution, one of the things Bill kept talking about was how when the industry became hit-driven, you couldn't get the shelf space for his type of game. Joel said the same thing with the SSI games, with the war games. You just couldn't get the shelf space anymore.
Right, but who needs shelves anymore?
Well, and that's the thing. It used to be the fans of those games were still there. There just weren't as many as for, let's say, a Doom clone, so the stores just had the Doom clones on the shelf. But now with digital distribution, those fans can find those games and can continue to buy them, and I really think that there is a bright future for this type of product at this time, but you only works if you're doing a worldwide digital-only distribution of the product.
Right, because otherwise you could just have turn to catalogs and like shipment of your games. If there's a local market that's big enough to justify the entire effort needed to put into program this stuff. Exactly.
And let's face it, retail is, I have great memories of both working at video game retail and spending countless hours browsing video game retail.
Right.
But at the same time, it was a solution that was dictated by the limitations of technology at the time.
Yeah.
And it just meant that there was a lot of product that was never going to reach its intended audience, or never going to get the audience penetration that it deserved because of that limited space at retail. Yeah. So I'm really, in many ways, glad that is not the only venue anymore.
Okay.
I'm just saying I don't want retail to die. I just don't want it to be the only venue.
Yeah,
that's what I'm saying.
I'm pretty sure it's gonna die.
Oh, there's going to be some dramatic changes after all this is over, but yes. For those listening in 10 years, we're living through the COVID-19 pandemic right now, in case it isn't obvious.
The first one, guys, the first one.
They'll be like, wait, there was a start to it?
Yeah, this is now, and we're still laughing.
We're still laughing.
Let's see how that'll turn out, man.
Okay.
Jesus. Okay, back to happier news. Arcade versus home. The debate heats up. I'm talking about happier news.
Playmeter magazine discusses whether home video is killing the coin-op video industry. And they were right. Little premature, but they were right. It's a really good spread in the magazine that interviews a bunch of people, including Joe Morici. And interview is coming soon. And the idea here was that with more powerful machines like the TurboGrafx 16 and the Sega Genesis, the rise of arcade cabinets like PlayChoice 10, which was an NES with cartridges in it that people would pay, that there might not be a market for the arcade, or at least that the arcade would become second fiddle to the console, with products simply being tested in the arcade before being shipped off to the to console, or even worse, that the arcade would just get console games and the development money wouldn't be going into the arcade. And this would be a major problem just because the arcades live off the fact that you could get experiences there that you couldn't get elsewhere. And if the game you were playing in the arcade was just as good as the game at home, then why am I dumping $30 worth of quarters into this game when I could just go spend $40 and have it at home forever?
Yeah.
And so these were the concerns, and they interviewed a bunch of sales reps at different companies, some arcade developers, some developers that were doing both, like Capcom. And it's a really interesting sort of moment of the arcade / console developers trying to say, no, of course not. And then Joe, basically in the interview, this is a little preview, said, oh yeah, we just saw the arcade as a testing ground to see what we were going to port and what weren't we going to port and what worked and what didn't work. Obviously, that's not what he told Playmeter magazine back in the day, but it's kind of obvious, and let's face it, the constantly improving graphics at home led to a lot of arcade games, especially by the time we get to 1995, just being slightly sped up or souped up versions of PlayStation games in the arcade cabinet. I mean, games like Tekken and even Tekken 2 and Tekken 3 were only slightly better in the arcade than they were on a standard home PlayStation. And there were a lot of games like this at the time, and then you get games like Street Fighter that went through so many iterations of the same game, basically, that there, other than the competitive side of the arcade, there was very little reason to be going into the arcade to play them. Not to say that the arcade didn't have some great exclusives, but it constantly became a harder and harder sell to people to go to the arcade and drop money there when home games were getting so good.
Right. For me, who didn't grow up with arcades, obviously, for obvious reasons. One, I'm too young. Two, I live in Germany. For me, it's really interesting to hear you talk about the arcades and the fascination that goes with it, and let's say, the nostalgia connected to that. But for me, I wouldn't go into a large hall where there are a whole lot of computer-ish machines where you can play games and you have to pop in money.
But you have to remember, you're not just playing any computer games. What you're playing is something that is the next generation above. So imagine.
Sure. But still, I mean, it wouldn't drag me in something that just looks better,
Oh, but it didn't just look better. I mean, you have to remember, especially in these, like 1990.
Yeah.
If you're playing Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles, the arcade game on your NES, the NES port, you are limited to 3 enemies on screen at a time, because the NES is already crapping out at that. If too many of them are on the same scan line, the last guy is missing his legs in that frame of animation because it can't process that many sprites.
Exactly, and this is exactly what I was saying.
But
this is exactly what I was saying. I mean, you are so fascinated about that, and you know all the differences. I mean, obviously, I don't know a whole lot about the differences of Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles. However, also this wouldn't be something that would drag me into an arcade. The only thing that would drag me into a place like this is if you have a really good setup virtual reality where when I move in the hall, I move in the game,
Well, okay. And you're looking at it from the modern point of view, but for example, but even go back to something like Hard Driving, which was a 3D car simulator. The 3D graphics were already miles and miles better than anything you could get at home, but on top of that, you sat down in a real car-like chair. You had the gear shift, you had the pedals, you had a force feedback steering wheel. So when you started skidding to take a sharp corner, you felt the vibrations on the steering wheel. That was the experience.
Yeah, and that would have been something that would get me into an arcade. But just,
think about
play a better version of Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles.
4 players at a time on Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles. So now you're playing with your 3 friends and playing 4 players at the same time on the game, something you couldn't do on the home versions because you only had 2 controller ports. And it wasn't just 3 enemies on the screen; it was like 10 enemies on the screen. Or you play a game like Galaxy Force 2, where you sat in this cabinet, this round cabinet. It would turn 360 degrees, so it would spin on its own axis, and when you turned left and right, it would tilt slightly. So for example, when you're moving your spaceship to the left, your whole body is tilted maybe 10-15 degrees to the left, and as you're turning, the whole thing is turning around. So the whole room around you is spinning as you're moving the ship back and forth.
Well, that's actually pretty nice, but how long would a quarter session usually last?
Oh, that game started at like 75 cents a pop.
Yeah, wonderful.
And you'll get maybe 4 or 5 minutes out of it.
Oh, Lord.
Maybe 10 if you're really good. But, I mean, it's an experience you couldn't have anyplace else.
Exactly.
And that's the key. Or just sitting down in an Outrun cabinet. Steering wheel, music, the speakers blaring behind your ears, and just driving down the coastline of California or something. Beautiful experience. You couldn't have that at home. So, I mean, yes, the arcade has always had to be a place of technological superiority. And one of the downsides of using console tech in the arcade was that a lot of games stopped impressing, and also it just became more and more practical to not do the big event art cabinet anymore.
Yeah.
And then you had the evergreens like Daytona USA. You will still find Daytona USA cabinets in arcades in the United States to this day, and the game is 30 years old at this point, almost. No, 25. But it still plays great. It's a great racing game, and when you can have 16 players in the same race, it's amazing. But you need 16 cabinets, or maybe 12 is the max. I'd have to look that up again. But you can have a lot of them chained together. So, okay. Fun stuff like that. Okay, but enough.
Well, you have to have been there.
Yeah, no, dude. Your generation just does not know that experience, and that experience is beautiful. It's beautiful. Beautiful. We'll have to go to the. Have we been together to the video game museum in Berlin?
No, we haven't.
No, okay. We need to go there. They have a small mini arcade set up in the museum, and with a bunch of games you can play. And they switch them out from time to time. They even last time I was there, they had a 4-player gauntlet, which was really, really cool. So, and it's just a tiny little corner of the museum, but you walk in and it's dark. It's got some neon lights. It's got the old carpet. It feels like an arcade. So, okay, we'll have to do that. Okay, but now back to the news.
Back to the news. TurboGrafx 16 gets a price cut.
NEC has announced that they will drop the price of the TurboGrafx 16 from its launch price of $199 to just $159, barely 6 months after launch.
Well, that always is a good sign.
Oh, yeah. Basically, NEC is seeing the writing on the wall that the PC Engine, which was the name of the console in Japan, it's already like 2 or 3 year old technology. It's fundamentally an 8-bit processor with a 16-bit graphics GPU, and they don't have the marketing muscle. They don't have the recognizable games. They don't have enough software support. This thing is just there's something needed to make this work in the U.S. market, and just doubling the size of the console, the physical size of the console, for no reason other than Americans like big things apparently, is not working for them.
Air circulation.
And no, literally they thought Americans wouldn't take the original PC Engine console seriously because the thing is so tiny. It basically fits in the palm of your hand. And they were just afraid people wouldn't take it seriously, so they built a much larger case for it.
Well, they don't know the Raspberry Pi crowd.
Yeah, that's true, but that's way too early for that. So, yeah. In the US, they're crashing and burning.
All right. Talking about the PC Engine, although the headline was the TurboGrafx 16, the PC Engine is finally coming to the United Kingdom.
After many months of speculation and countless gray import consoles being sold, Ace Magazine is reporting that NEC's PC Engine, which just launched in the US as the TurboGrafx 16 the previous year, would get a UK release at just £99. Now, according to Wikipedia, and of course we have to take that with a grain of salt, there was a planned European launch of the console using gray versions of the retooled US version of the console, but that was scrapped in the last minute, and UK company Telegames purchased the existing stock and would sell the system primarily through mail order for several more years. So, first off, £99 in 1990 was a whole hell of a lot more than £99 is today.
Yeah.
because the pound took a whacking right around this.
Due to recent events.
No. They took a pounding in I think 1990 or 91. George Soros famously bet against the pound, and it devalued the pound dramatically, lost like 20 or 30% of its value. So the pound loses a lot of ground right around this time. So I don't know exactly how much 99 pounds was at this point, but it was considerably more than just 10-20% above the dollar. So yeah, it was almost a 2-to-1. It would have been pricey, but it wouldn't have been outlandish. It would have been closer to the U.S. launch price, as far as I can tell. And the problem is, it never actually gets that official launch. NEC just gets cold feet. They built a bunch of these, and then they just sell them to Telegames, and Telegames sort of piecemeals them through mail order, because sending it to retail, they'd have to basically cut the price in half so that the retailer gets half of it. They didn't want to do that, or at least a big chunk of it. And since they only had a limited stock anyway, if they had to send out large quantities all at once, that would have been the end of their inventory.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, it's for me, it's really just startling, like that NEC is preparing everything, and just when they were about to hit the market, they were like, nah, we don't even want to try.
Well, I mean, they just had a Christmas season in the U.S. where they basically got their butts handed to them. The NES was still going super strong. The Genesis, comes in a distant second. Remember when we talked about the Christmas sales numbers, we had like 4 different SKUs for the NES before we even got to the Genesis. So the NES is selling like 10-to-1 or something against the Genesis, and the Genesis is outselling the TurboGrafx also by multiples. So they're really a non-factor at this point in the market, and I don't think NEC has the stomach to make the investment to try to sell this system, knowing full well that they've already been previewing the follow-up system in Japan.
Yeah.
So the Super Graphics is coming. It's hard to really sell the idea that, invest in this new system because we've got another one coming. And yeah, and this is also in part this weirdly fragmented world that we have in 1990, where a console can come out in Japan 2 years or 3 years before it hits the US, where you have always at least 1 whole year difference between console launches on different continents, and then you still don't even know if it's going to come out in Europe.
Yep.
And so, yeah. And here, NEC just decided we're no longer a player in this.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, if you explain it like this, it totally makes sense.
Yeah. And it's kind of sad because the TurboGrafx had a real cult following amongst gray importers in Europe. And there's a lot of European developers who talk about the massive influence the TurboGrafx games had on their development, and the types of games that they went on to make, because the NES wasn't really a factor. The Master System was kind of weak sauce as far as cutting-edge games were concerned, but the TurboGrafx was showing them, this is what we could do. Like people like Manfred Trenz and the Factor 5 guys here in Germany really get inspired by those games, and they try to bring that level of polish and action to a lot of their Amiga titles. Games like Apidia, Turrican, Catechus are all being influenced by TurboGrafx titles that these guys are playing. Yeah.
Okay.
But alas, not for the common man.
Not for the common man. Speaking about things not existing for the common man, Atari's Panther is waiting in the wings.
Atari UK boss Bob Gledow, I think that's how he pronounced his name, spills the beans on the Atari Panther, a console based on the Atari ST technology that apparently is being sidelined to give the Lynx the spotlight for the coming Christmas season. The Panther, being developed by Flare Technologies, was apparently fully functional, and dev kits had even gone out to developers before the system got canceled for Flare's 64-bit Jaguar design. So
they really like it, or they really like developing stuff up to the end and then never releasing it.
Jack Trammell's Atari is a mystery hidden within a conundrum and locked in a black box. Yeah, I've actually sent out interview requests to some of the people involved with the company. I haven't heard back yet. I mean, other than, of course, the Atari bits that we heard in my Michael Katz interviews, and go back and listen to those, where we do get a little bit of the idea of how chaotically managed the company was. He obviously left well before this, but this is just the latest. I mean, in the last 12 months, we've probably had at least 12 different hardware announcements from Atari. And the idea of the Panther, this Atari ST-based console, is just the latest iteration of them taking old existing computer tech and trying to turn it into a console. And Michael said the same thing in the interview. He said this pipe dream of Jack Trammell's of having something that is both a budget computer and at the same time the most powerful console in the world doesn't really work, or it's kind of it's let me put it this way. I think it really is Trammell not respecting console tech, and it largely comes because he admittedly didn't really know anything about computers. He admittedly didn't use computers. So in his mind, computer is better than console was a result of him not understanding what was necessary to make those graphics work, what kind of massive power was necessary for all those elements to come together in a game console, and thus always underestimating just how much more technically advanced a console needs to be from a computer in the graphics department in order to compete. And here we have it again. And Flare Technology, the ones developing this, they're the ones who are going to go off and make the 64-bit Jaguar. And they were also, at least partially, the team that were building the Conix before that. So the Conix multi-system. So these guys just don't have a lot of luck getting hardware out on time.
Oh Lord.
Yeah.
Oh well. Let's move on, because there are even more topics ahead of us than we already talked about for some weird reason.
Oh Jesus! Yeah, we're not even at the halfway point. Okay, keep going.
Yeah, Sega lines up computer games for the Genesis.
Electronic Arts, Epix, and Microprose all agree to bring existing PC titles to the Genesis. This will no doubt strengthen the system's library at a time when Nintendo was still forcing developers into exclusivity agreements, barring them from releasing games on multiple platforms, and also bring in a lot of new, some more sophisticated games to appeal to an older audience than those on the NES. And I mean, it made sense for the Genesis to try to do this. Sega desperately needed more games. Sega needed to appeal to the American audience. And a lot of the games that came over, I mean, weren't necessarily games you were going to see on a console traditionally, but they were games that gave the Genesis a certain cachet amongst the American teenage audience. And I mean, I'm just thinking some of the titles that come off the top of my head. SSI ends up developing a Book Rogers game for them. Electronic Arts brings over Centurion Defender of Rome, which was essentially an evolution of Defender of the Crown from the same team that made that game. And obviously the sports titles like Madden, which really use the 68,000 chip in the Genesis to wonderful results, lots of action on the screen. And so, yeah, I mean, it's good times. Not necessarily the best games on the Genesis, but it really does put the Genesis on the map.
Okay, but Electronic Arts doesn't only talk to Sega, they also become an NES
Licensee. Yeah. Licensee. Oh, yeah, it sounds like it's 3 words, but it's not. When Trip Hawkins originally launched EA, he was focused exclusively on the home computer market, even looking down on consoles. The rise of the NES, though, did not go unnoticed, and several prominent EA titles, such as Skate or Die and Jordan vs. Bird, got ports to Nintendo's 8-bit through licensing deals with the likes of Konami and Milton Bradley. Now, though, with their Sega Gambit already in the can and development of Genesis titles well underway, they have announced that they will also publish games for the NES. Not many titles would be released, with the Immortal and Skate or Die 2 being the only 2 I could find. But Computer Gaming World magazine, of course, immediately asked then VP Bing Gordon whether the company would continue to support computers, and he assured them that 13 new DOS and 11 new Amiga products were in the pipeline for the coming year.
Oh, Lord. I mean, they were only allowed to publish like 5 games for the NES, so why should they give up their multi-platform business?
That's the deal is like this, that Computer Gaming World is so paranoid. We've talked about this a ton of times. The editors of this magazine are paranoid as hell that nobody's going to bother making games for computers anymore. And they see consoles as this, oh, damn kids, and get off my lawn type of thing. And at the same time, the NES really is dying. So just as Tripp is signing this deal, just as he is getting games ready for publication on the NES really doesn't have a lot of life left in it as far as a market leader is concerned. They're going to have Christmas of 1991 is still going to be a very successful year for them, but the cracks are going to be showing by 91. The Genesis is going to do very good business in 91, and the Super Nintendo is coming. So it's obvious that this is not where he's going to be making his money. It's going to be a risky business making cartridges. The Genesis was where it's at. He'll move on to the Super Nintendo as well. But yeah, this is a short-lived deal. Like I said, I only found those 2 games that EA published themselves. They may have also had Caveman Olympics, but I think that was also still published through a third party. So yeah, they were called Caveman Games on the NES. But yeah, Electronic Arts is still going to be primarily a computer game company for the next few years.
Well, let's keep on talking a little bit about the NES for a while, because Mindscape becomes the first party publisher of NES titles becomes the first third party publisher.
Yeah.
Small difference. Of NES titles in Europe.
In a further sign of Nintendo's expansion into Europe, the granting of a third-party publishing license to Mindscape, which had been purchased in December of '89 by Software Toolworks, should help expand the NES's appeal with European gamers used to Mindscape's computer titles. Whether their launch titles, Paperboy and 720 Degrees, will make much of an impact is doubtful, but their announced Dirty Harry and Mad Max games could help in markets like the UK, where Mario's cuddly image may not sell as well. So,
I like Mario, but also I'm not in the UK, so who am
well,
I?
Well, that was the big question, is whether or not the cuddly companion figure was going to find a ready audience. Mm-hmm. And this actually shows this opinion that comes directly out of the magazines, and I do think in many ways was reflective of the gaming press as a whole. Mm-hmm. They thought that edgy was the way to go. You have to remember that the computer market in England is not necessarily dominated, but strongly influenced by arcade ports. Arcade games are getting more violent. Things like Operation Wolf, Operation Thunderbolt, all the action titles, Sly Spy and whatnot. There's a lot of killing, blah, 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 blah. And the days of the happy little munchkin jumping around, like the Manic Miner games, are felt to be over.
Okay.
And the
turtles
element,
Yoshi occasionally.
Well, but the problem here is that what they're forgetting is that those games, just like most arcade games, live off of the short-term spectacle, the attraction of just seeing something new. And the extremely tightly designed Mario-style games, where every jump has been tested and everything works, is a level of polish that the UK developers have never seen. They have no basis for comparison at this point because there's virtually no European software that's made at that level, and you couldn't invest the amount of time necessary to get it to that level and still be a profitable product in a extremely hit-driven, short shelf life industry like the UK games industry. So they're just looking at the character going, this will never sell, without considering that, guess what? A more polished game will have a shelf life. A more polished game will be played by people for years to come, and you can make money as long as you can get rid of the piracy issues, which you can do with cartridges. And this is where, at this point, they're skeptical of all those factors being as important as they are, but they are that important, and they will change the way this entire industry works. So, once it comes, it will work, but it's interesting that Mindscape gets this license as the first third-party publisher, and they are just bringing arcade ports. 720 Degrees is a skateboard game. It's originally an Atari arcade title, and Paperboy is also an arcade title. Mm-hmm. Yeah. And Dirty Harry and Mad Max. The Dirty Harry game comes out. Can't remember if the Mad Max game gets canceled and there's just a prototype floating around, or if it actually did get released. But both games are basically pretty terrible. So.
All right. Speaking of success in Europe,
well, not quite, but yes. Speaking of computer software companies.
Yes, Sierra buys Dynamics.
A letter of intent was signed on March 27th between Dynamics and Sierra for the outright purchase of the studio. We talked about how Sierra was interested in acquiring Dynamics' 3D tech back in October of '89, but now Sierra has decided to acquire the studio outright. This new deal would bring us such classics as Rise of the Dragon, Heart of China, The Incredible Machine, and Red Baron. No, none of those games mean anything to you, do they?
They do, in fact. The Incredible Machine and Red Baron.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Oh, okay. Well,
Yeah. When I was a kid, my grandma bought me a Sierra's whatever box for whatever reason. I really don't know how she got her hands onto that. But amongst others, there was next to Woodruff and the Schnibble of Azimuth, however that is pronounced properly. But also there was the Incredible Machine, and this thing I really loved this game, man.
oh yeah. Well, and this is the thing. Dynamics is, for my money, the single most creative studio that has ever existed. They every single game they made, even when it wasn't 100% as far as the realization of the idea, every single game was just swinging for the fences, was trying to outdo anything that had been done before, push the technology, push the ideas. And if you saw the Dynamics logo, you knew when I load this, I'm going to see something I've never seen before. And yeah, and this is why their games were always that next level. And I loved them on the Commodore 64. Up until this point, before they were purchased by Sierra, they had self-published for a while. They'd been published by EA. They'd been published by Activision. Then they self-published again, and now they're owned by a big studio. And they would last until the fall of Sierra itself 10 years later.
Okay.
Yeah. And I'm trying to get an interview with Jeff Nuttall, the founder of the company, co-founder of the company, because yeah, the guy is an idol of mine. Hopefully, we can make that happen. So really want to get that interview in. Because no, I mean, the guy is still making games to this day. He's seen it all. He's from the first microcomputers to console to handheld, and just getting some of the ideas and the risk taking that was developing innovative ideas with innovative tech.
Yeah.
That I'd love to find out about. But okay, enough of me gushing about my love of Dynamics. I've done it enough on this show. Let's move on.
Let's move on. Ultima 4, no, 5, no, 6.
Roman numerals are not your strength, are they? I should have just written the normal letter, number 6 there. Okay.
Actually, it works pretty fine most of the time.
Yeah.
Oh well. So, Ultima 6 will not be coming to the Apple II. See, 2 is easy.
For the first time in the series' history, Apple II users will have to go without the newest Ultima title. Given the game's development on VGA DOS machines, the likelihood of porting this down to the aging 8-bit architecture in a way that would be both technically and financially feasible is slim. The C64 would be the only 8-bit port of the game, and Ultima 6 would also be the last entry into the series to appear on systems such as the Amiga, Atari ST, and Sharp X68000.
First of all, I want to mention that for the text that you just spoke, you wrote out the numbers, Latin numbers in Arabic numbers. So,
well, oh, you mean for Ultima 6?
Yeah.
Yeah, okay. Yeah, when I got to the end, I probably just wrote out 6. It was easier. But,
right, and also 68,000. I mean...
But that's the actual name of the machine. Ultima 6 on the package is written in Arabic numerals. If you look at the links to the Moby Games entries, I put in the links for both Ultima 7 and Ultima 6. They're in Roman numerals in the URL.
Okay.
Yeah, see? You can't... No. So,
I'm
okay,
not getting out of it, don't I?
No, you're not getting out of it. So the Ultima series, basically, was always a series that was trying to push some technical boundaries, but was being held back by the insistence at the Apple II get a port. And this is the first time when they're just saying, yeah, we just can't do it anymore. And for a lot of people, it's kind of sad. And even the computer gaming world kind of is almost apologizing to Apple II users here in their text. And the fact that the Commodore 64 got a version it was kind of an insult to them. But at the same time, the Commodore 64 could still do the colors, and if you played it on a Commodore 128, you got enhanced music. So there you go.
Not bad.
Pretty cool. Yeah, pretty cool. But yeah, I mean, and systems like the Amiga, Atari ST and stuff, they were all going to be dropped from the next installment, Ultima 7, because the game was just unplayable without a hard drive at that point.
Okay.
Yeah, and all these other systems, for all their technical prowess, did not come standard with a hard drive, and hard drives were almost non-existent amongst the users. Nobody bothered to buy one, because if you're going to buy a hard drive, just buy a PC.
Right. So those guys wouldn't have a customer base anyways.
Exactly.
Right.
Unlike, the Lucasfilm, for example, was one of the last big U.S. game makers to still support the Amiga, and the Noah Falstein interview, which is already recorded, which it will be coming hopefully soon. Another hint: I had to tell him that I played Indiana Jones and the Fate of Atlantis on my Amiga. It was 14 floppy disks, and I only had 2 floppy drives. No hard drive. That was a lot of disk swapping. A lot of disk swapping. Okay. Let's finish this up. Come on. We're heading to the end line of 1990. Let's do it.
This is cool. The C-Cube is not the C-Cube, but C-Cube is making digital video affordable.
Tech firm C-Cube Microsystems, a pioneer in digital imaging and video compression, has announced a new $150 chip that decodes compressed video. Arcade Trade publication Replay sees this as an interactive video made affordable. The primary use for the chips will end up being in VCD players that would become big in Japan in DirecTV boxes.
Okay.
So basically, this is one of those early chips that allows for MPEG-2 decoding.
Yeah.
And I mean, their chip and many other manufacturers later on really make the MPEG-2 standard something that you can actually put into a device. It's still very expensive at this point, but over the next 10 years or so, the evolution of this tech is basically the foundation of the television sets we all have today.
But isn't that cool that earlier you really had to have this pretty expensive chip just for this one task?
Oh, of course. I mean, if you look at a machine like, for example, Philips' CDI, or even later on the 3DO, if you wanted the proper full... Oh, no, 3DO may have had it built in, but I know CDI, you had to buy an extra MPEG card to watch so-called VCD movies. That was a special format before DVD that allowed you to watch video on a CD.
Yeah, I know.
And it was pretty crappy video quality, but it was huge in Japan, and I believe South Korea as well. VCD format really took off. As an alternative VHS, and may have had to do with the fact that the discs took up less space on your shelf than a VHS. But yeah, it was just one of those situations where that MPEG decoding on a chip, having a dedicated chip just for that, made a lot more sense than trying to raw power it through a CPU, because you're going to need a much, much more powerful CPU to do that. Yeah.
Okay.
And the idea of putting it into an arcade cabinet kind of made sense. So if you're going to do arcade games with video, like a Dragon's Lair, like a Mad Dog McCree, this was going to make it possible without having to run a Laserdisc system. Because Laserdisc did the same thing with analog signals. The only problem with Laserdisc is they constantly break down, especially if you're spinning them all day long. But you have to do it in an arcade cabinet because even when somebody's not playing, you still have the attract mode running.
Right.
Yeah. So.
All right.
And speaking of the movies.
Speaking of the movies, Titus has won the right to make a Dick Tracy game, and we've all lost.
The most anticipated film of the coming summer box office season is no doubt going to be Warren Beatty's Dick Tracy. Comic book movie adaptations were hot after Batman in 1989, and the star power of Beatty, Al Pacino, and Madonna were early going to make this one a huge hit. CU Amiga magazine is reporting that the rights to develop the game have gone to Titus. This would be only partially true with Bandai getting the NES rights, Sega picking up the rights for the Genesis and Master System, and Disney doing a parallel version for Amiga and DOS. Each licensee would deliver a completely different game, but only Titus could make a C64 title that was so unfinished and terrible it has been considered by many to be the worst commercially released title on the system.
Oh, Lord.
Oh, you have no idea. It's essentially you are the yellow rectangle walking from left to right with no scrolling, shooting at the blue rectangles that appear at different points of the screen. Sometimes they match up to what might be a window. Sometimes they don't. There's no way to properly describe how bad this is. Even the developers have gone on record saying that the game was not finished and they just pushed it out anyway because they had a release date.
Okay.
Yeah,
and they didn't have any possibilities to send out day one patches.
Yeah, no, that was not an option back in the day. No, this thing was just absolutely terrible. Now, Titus is infamous for creating games that get the qualification of worst game ever. They also did Superman on the N64.
Oh, that's good.
But I would argue that that's still a playable game. This is far, far worse. This game really is the worst commercially available game I have ever played. Now, I know there's other contenders for the title, but this thing is just broken beyond broken.
Mm-hmm.
It's bad.
You know, I'm always wondering, I mean, today, okay, you ship out those day one patches and they fix the worst issues, and then you patch, and sometimes, eventually the game works. But back then, how could you ship something like that? I mean, you're basically putting the arrow to your own knee. You're killing yourself.
It all depends on what the return policies are. I don't know what the return policies at the time were on software, but it was mainly just get it out in time to coincide either with the DVD release or theatrical release of the game, and hope that enough kids wouldn't complain. And I mean, we're not talking $80 cartridges or $70 cartridges. We were talking, 10, 14 pound games on cassette or disc.
Well, but still, I mean, do you want to be known as the company whose games are always shitty?
That depends if people are still buying them. I mean, it didn't really seem to matter too much to LJN. But yeah, no, you are correct that there is a certain amount of pride that should go into something like this. But yeah, no, this game, Titus made a lot of shitty games, and they made a lot of money off of something. Apparently, they had good distribution. I mean, the game marketing always looked great. Fire and Forget 2, I remember, attracted me. I was like, ooh, this looks good. I should try to play this. No, it was terrible. But you still went along with it thinking, well, it can't be all that bad. Look, it's got a cool car on it. Night Force was another one which was unplayable drivel, but the artwork looked great. I remember hanging the ad up on my wall as a kid because I thought the artwork looked awesome. So and that's just the nature of the beast with these things. Some companies survive even though arguably the games are bad, but they hit the right marketing niche. Go figure. So
right.
yeah, that's the end of May of 1990. Let's turn on the time machine and head off to May of 2000.
As an industry, video gaming is bigger than Hollywood.
Y2K. Electronic launch in history.
Welcome to May of 2000. Still enjoy being able to say 2000. Okay. What's
It will
our
always
first story,
sound like
Peter?
the future.
Yeah, it'll always sound like the future to me. I see it already when my daughter looks at me and is like, you do know that was 25 years ago, right? It reminds me of that line from the Futurama episode where the Star Trek crew shows up and Fry is like, we should watch the old Star Trek movies. Like, why are you fascinated about a show that's set 600 years in the past? Okay.
Yeah, that's true. But still, even for me, 2000 always sounds like the future. Anyhow, the Dreamcast peripheral.
Okay.
Okay,
Sorry.
let's get.
No,
That's fine. You can just cut it out and try it again. Dreamcast peripheral.
You do know I'm not cutting that out, right?
That's okay. And you might want to jump to the 10th try. That eventually it will work. Dreamcast peripherals proliferate. Dude, who writes those headlines?
Oh yeah, that might be me. Yeah. So, in the shadow of the massive Japanese launch of the PS2, Sega announces new peripherals for the Dreamcast. The Dream Eye is a digital camera that will interface with the Dreamcast and a handful of titles. It's the first console-enabled digital camera. The Game Boy camera add-on predated it, but that was for handhelds. Sadly, it would not see release outside of Japan. And then the Swatch Access is a peripheral that would allow the Dreamcast to interact with Swatch's line of chip-enabled Swatch Access watches. Say that 3 times fast. These were watches that had either ski data chips, that's all spelled together, it's a weird company name, which allowed for keyless access to ski resorts, or a chip that allowed for digital payments at participating venues. The Dreamcast peripheral that looks like a large disc that plugs into the VMU slot looks a bit ridiculous. The planned April or May launch was quickly scrapped after being announced in February. So, yeah, Sega's Dreamcast plans are, just a little bit out there. Well, I mean, the Dream Eye is actually a decent idea, and we're going to see it revitalized again and again and again. PlayStation is going to do it. Well, I mean, it's a digital camera interface, so basically you could use it for games where you move and it notices, well, something moved on the screen and tries to guess, that you knocked the virtual item off the screen or something.
Mm-hmm.
And
That
PlayStation is
technology
going to
did
have
work
that.
well.
Yeah, well, and it really didn't work well with this low resolution. I mean, the PlayStation is going to get one of these. The Xbox later on is going to have one of these.
60, the Kinect, but also that didn't really work.
Exactly. I mean, these are limited technologies given the fact that you don't have a proper CPU AI that is really detecting who you are, what's going on, and so forth. It's just a little too early for this kind of tech, and the Dreamcast really just doesn't have the CPU muscle for this kind of thing in any serious capacity. But yeah, and then the Swatch thing is just freaking pathetic. It's it's basically Sega's desperately looking for partners after most of the software developers abandoned them, and they're trying to find something that they can do with the platform that's not going to, or that's going to catch them some kind of headlines. And remember, this thing has Windows CE built into it, so in theory, you could try to use it as a computer of sorts, or you're going to be able to surf the internet and whatever. But yeah, Sega's got some problems.
Yeah, they've got some problems, and they forecast a loss of over $400 million.
The actual loss for the fiscal year ending March 2000 would be $404 million, similar to their losses the previous year. Poor sales of the Dreamcast in Japan were mainly to blame. So, yeah, I mean, we talked about their massive launch in the US, but that was a year after the launch in Japan. And this is one of the last consoles that's going to have that major 1 year difference. The PlayStation 2 is going to launch in both countries in the same year. Xbox the same. But the Dreamcast was still working off that old model. And like so many things about the Dreamcast, it's a generation too late. It's doing everything. It's winning the last war. And the game has changed.
Yeah. So they are really trying everything to get the Dreamcast on the market. Amongst others, Sega.com is going to give you a Dreamcast for free.
Yeah, as long as you sign up for a 2-year service contract with Sega Net. Okay. Taking a page from existing internet PCs, which are being given away in exchange for long-term service contracts, Sega hopes to lure people to the Dreamcast not just as a game console, but also as an online set-top box. The free machine would be paid for in the form of a $200 rebate when you sign up for the service. Not a bad deal in retrospect, since the service would be shut down in July of 2001.
So
a little over a year. Yeah. I mean, we've talked about before, it's the cell phone model. You buy the device, pay as you go. And at this point, internet service, and we've talked about this, how big the internet is getting, how Sega had talked about starting a separate corporation called Sega.com. And and here we find out Sega.com is basically trying to be an ISP for the Dreamcast. And the cell phone model hasn't really taken off yet because we don't have smartphones yet. Cell phones aren't that expensive yet. But PCs, I remember these PCs at the time were being given away. You had these e-machines and stuff where if you paid for a contract for AOL or CompuServe or whoever it was at the time, you'd get the machine for free. It was a low-end desktop PC, but it was a PC and you could surf the web. And for a lot of people, that was a really, really good way to get into the internet age on a budget.
I mean, this is basically the reason why those companies did it.
Oh, of course, of course. And at the time, ISPs also thought that they were going to be making money off of advertising or whatever else, because usually they would also provide you an email address and things like that. So there was probably sales of people's addresses and all sorts of other shady stuff happening in the background. Unfortunately, it was all going to prove to be for naught because there just wasn't an economic model there, especially with dial-up connections. Soon as the cable companies came in, there you go, you're dead. As long as your place that had cable. So.
Yeah. Well, but you at least let them dream. They just want to dream. They dreamed their dream just as in Dreamer, which had a dream.
The startup company in Dreama. Nice transition, by the way. Very well done.
Yep.
Has announced their L600 game console, a Linux box using a 600 megahertz processor and supporting HD TV output. Will be the first open architecture game console. The company hopes to launch in 2001 at the very competitive price of just $299. Sound too good to be true? A true competitor to machines like the PlayStation 2 and Xbox? Well, the startup ran out of money, declaring bankruptcy in April of 2001. The founder, John Gildred, said at the time that they were $10 million shy of being able to launch the system. Yeah.
So what do you want to say about that?
Well, you see, we already had an open platform system like this. It was called the PC. And had they just said, you know what, we cut a deal with Microsoft and we're putting Windows on this thing, maybe it would have worked, or DOS. But trying to convince people to develop for Linux, it just wasn't going to work. It wasn't going to happen. And 600 megahertz sounds great, but I couldn't find any details as to what the video card was going to be with any certainty. And the HD TV output, that was going to put them back quite a chunk, especially since nobody really had an HD TV at the time. So they were still also going to have to include an analog converter. And that was also going to be a chunk of change. So you're going to add at least $15-20 to the cost of the machine.
Maybe they just wanted to build those machines for themselves and they needed some money for doing that.
Yeah, I'm sorry, but if you got to spend if you were still 10 million shy of building a 600 megahertz machine for yourself, you got some problems.
Fair enough. I mean, they had some problems because, it didn't turn out well.
It did not turn out well for them, but go figure. It was another one of these. This was also the era when Linux was the catchphrase in everybody's on everybody's mind. Everybody was thinking, "Ooh, we're finally going to take down Microsoft and Windows."
I had an informatics teacher who, up to 2008, believed that Linux will overrun Windows.
Oh, Jesus Christ! Hey, I was working at the computer labs at the University of Florida around this time, and I had to listen to all the people telling me how great Linux was, and they spent an entire weekend getting Age of Empires or some other game running on it, and I'm just like, oh, great! So does it all work? Well, I still don't have the sound working. I was like, oh, Jesus Christ! And I was like, oh, so you got the Voodoo wrapper working? No. 3D accelerators don't work either. Oh, screw you. You know what I spent my weekend doing? I was playing Wipeout Excel, okay? Or I installed Bleem and I was playing some PlayStation title. It's over. Just oh well. Okay. Yeah. The one good thing to come out of open source was Open Office, which is what I still use. So go figure. Okay. On
All right.
to less open things.
Until there's way less open things in many regards. Nintendo vies for Harry Potter rights.
Electronic Gaming Monthly reports that Nintendo is close to cutting a deal with the rights to make games based on Harry Potter. They speculate that the first game would be around in time for the first film. Now, they clearly got some very old news, as the auction for the rights happened back in 1998, and the proposals developed by Nintendo were abandoned as Warner Brothers put their full financial might behind acquiring the media rights to the books. And this is, this is a story. There's some good documentation online about this, and I've included links to it, where Nintendo was trying to get the rights to the Harry Potter books. This would have been basically a video game only deal.
Yeah.
And what became apparent quite quickly was that the Harry Potter rights holders really were looking for a cover all your bases approach.
Yeah.
And that's what Warner Brothers could offer. They could offer the movie in coordination with video game production. Electronic Arts takes over, I believe, the games under supervision from Warner Brothers Interactive, or some cooperation there. Maybe just distributorship. I'm not quite sure what the deal was. But this is how you get that full-on media blitz when the first Harry Potter movie comes out, which Nintendo probably would have done some very interesting things, and they did mock-ups of what the game artwork might be. But considering that Nintendo was still on the N64 at this point, which had very limited market penetration, it really would not have done the license any good. Not that the games that came out were all that spectacular, but still, it wouldn't have done the license any good.
There is no N64 game of Harry Potter, is there? I mean, I know
No, I
there's
think
a
there
PlayStation
are,
game.
aren't there? If I were pulling up Moby Games as we're saying this, but the Harry Potter license, I mean, the PlayStation 1 still got games. Unless, of course, Electronic Arts just didn't bother to support the N64 at that point. So Sorcerer's Stone has a Game Boy Advance, Macintosh.
Oh yeah, there's
Game
also
Boy
a Game Boy
Color,
Color version.
PlayStation. Okay, but yeah, no N64. They went straight to the GameCube with Chamber of Secrets.
Okay.
You're right. So no N64, just PlayStation, Game Boy Color, computers, and Game Boy Advance.
Because I had the Game Boy Color versions of it, and I actually really liked it. It was a little bit like a RPG.
Yeah, I recently watched a video on that where the first one is almost impenetrable if you haven't read the books, because they don't explain what any of the spells do and stuff. But I believe it's Punching Weight. It's a YouTube channel. They do some great videos about games that try to do things on hardware that probably shouldn't be done, which is a topic I always find fascinating. I just love seeing people try to push hardware further than it should go. So one of the big complaints they had was, if you don't know all the characters ahead of time and you don't know all the spells, you're lost in the game. And apparently, apparently in the second game it's better.
I beat the game, and yeah, the second game was better. That's true, but the first game, I don't know. I can just remember the feelings I had for this game, and I really enjoyed it. But yeah, I also read the books, so
exactly. And the second one fixes some of those problems apparently by giving you a lot more information about what the spells do and introducing you to the characters a little bit better and so forth. And those were the only two on the Game Boy Color. After that, the 2003 releases. So you got Chamber of Secrets, and then after Chamber of Secrets, you've got Prisoner of Azkaban is Game Boy Advance only.
Oh, right, yeah, true. But also in the second one, you play Quidditch, if I remembered right.
That is definitely possible. There's also, I think, a flying sequence with the car.
Yeah. Yep.
Yeah,
it's in there.
but I'm looking just at the screenshots right now for Prisoner of Azkaban on the Game Boy Advance, and it kind of looks a little bit like one of the Shining Force games on the Genesis. So it looks like a turn-based RPG.
Well, this is what Harry Potter was on the Game Boy Color as well. It was a turn-based RPG.
Yeah.
Before turn-based, so I'm really wondering why not knowing the spells would have been a problem, because you could figure it out pretty quickly.
Well, yeah, but it's still a lot of experimentation of figuring out what the spell does.
Well, there weren't so many spells to begin with, and you would learn them through going through the game. So
are you really trying to now justify the faults in a Game Boy Color game from 20 years ago?
Yes, because I really liked it.
When was the last time you went back to it?
Ask me that tomorrow and I will say yesterday.
Should I ask you tomorrow whether or not you would still defend it?
Maybe.
I think this is a conversation we may have to pick up again next month. But in the meantime, let us continue on.
Yes, happy news. Daikatana releases. Finally.
After years of delays, John Romero's Daikatana hit store shelves in the US in May. Next Gen magazine wonders which game will ever be able to replace it as, quote, the easiest joke ever, end quote. Hi, Duke Nukem. How are you? Okay, so yes, Daikatana came out. It was at best mediocre and was very quickly forgotten. And then came Duke Nukem Forever, which took forever to make. So, yeah, it very quickly got replaced as the longest in development title. And yeah, so you never played Daikatana?
Nah.
Didn't miss anything, trust me. Yeah, there's a lot of interesting ideas and potential, but it came to naught, sadly. And John Romero's company did not last much longer after that. So, so much sadness.
Well, I mean, I didn't play Daikatana. However, I played The Sims for some reason, and they arrived also in 2000.
We don't normally talk about game reviews here on the show, but this is one that deserves a few minutes. The Sims gets a massive review in this month's issue of CGW. Of course, the game was phenomenally successful right out of the gate, but it really stood out because it took the idea of user-created content and online community to a whole new level, especially considering that it was a single-player game. CGW spends quite some space on examples of people's creations in the game, how people are finding creative solutions, and just being sadistic bastards. The modern DLC and streaming culture wasn't invented completely by the game, but it's hard to imagine it without the influence of The Sims. So yes.
Being a sadistic bastard. Oh, yeah.
Exactly. So, yeah, I can't not mention it. The most sold PC series of all time, a mega success, probably the most mainstream PC gaming experience ever created. Yeah, it was huge, and the fact that it was recognized as huge by virtually all the magazines simultaneously. I mean, through all the publications the last couple months, every place where The Sims shows up, even though the hardcore editors and journalists at these magazines sort of, are like, who's actually who is this for? They all have to admit they all get hooked on it. That is something extraordinary, and the fact that it's got the online community thing built in the box is something that no game that I can recall had prior to it, where you post like a photo album of your characters and the greatest moments and stuff like this, and automatically have it shared online. That was unprecedented. So
what also was unprecedented is the massive amount of DLCs, add-ons, which was just insane. I mean, I think it wasn't. It started at Sims 2. I mean, at Sims 1, they had some expansion packs. They had a lot of expansion packs.
Sims 1 had a lot of expansion packs.
Yeah, but I think with Sims 2, they really took it way over the edge. Right? Can't you just get some accessories? I think with Sims 2, they introduced the accessories, and this is just nuts.
Well, I don't disagree with you, but yeah, I mean, they went overboard with it, but at the same time, you were talking about a product that was so mainstream, and for so many consumers, the only game they played.
Okay, but diesel, jeans, accessories, please.
No, but this was the whole thing. It's there. If this is the only game you play, so let's say you are a typical gamer. How many games a year do you buy?
I don't know, but yeah, fair enough. If it's the only game you buy, they'll surely spend way less money than I spent per year on a game.
Exactly, and this is going to be one of those moments where you really have to put that perspective into it. And I think that it makes sense given the circumstances.
But this is true for a whole lot of stuff, man.
Well, yeah, but no, I don't think so many people would buy the blue jeans for their Sims if you didn't have the online component of sharing.
Yeah, sure.
That cannot be understated. If you didn't have the online sharing component, you probably wouldn't be selling this many add-on packs.
Well, this is true. But since let's talk about other stuff. Triforge takes to the web.
3 veteran Blizzard designers have left the house that Warcraft built to found Triforge. The company would soon change its name to ArenaNet and launch the Guild Wars series of online RPGs, which is still going to this day. The company would be bought out by their publisher NCSoft in 2008. Ever play Guild Wars?
I'm not into the online RPG thing.
Yeah.
I started this. I played. Oh, geez, what was it? I think Neverwinter Online and Lord of the Rings Online. I mean, all those free-to-play titles. I gave them a try, but somehow, no, didn't get me hooked.
I hear you. I can totally understand that. I was a beta tester on Ultima Online way back in the day, and it just never really caught on with me. But Guild Wars is one of the more successful ones out there, and the fact that it was founded by former Blizzard guys just kind of makes sense. They knew what was happening, and this is, of course, well before WoW. So it's kind of interesting to see them hitting the going out there and launching this. And you can only wonder, what their former colleagues back at Blizzard were thinking, whether or not they were already developing WoW at this point, or if it's something that comes after the fact. So that I didn't look into exactly when WoW's development started, but clearly online is the place to go, and the fact that they changed their name to ArenaNet shows that they were dedicated to online gameplay as opposed to anything else.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, again, as I said, I never really got into the online gaming community. I enjoy me a good single-player game with a good story.
Yep. And so, as do I. Now, how easy is it to find those is the question.
I have no idea. Let's just move on. Fiendish Games, reviews, revives.
Revives.
The budget.
Bring it back to life.
I'm sorry, it's really getting late.
Sorry. It's so good. We're almost through. We're
almost there. Fiendish Games revives the budget title.
The UK budget market is a tradition going back to the early days of home micros, like the Spectrum, where pocket change could buy you a brand new game at the local newsagent. Fiendish Games, a division of Criterion Entertainment, famous for their renderware engine and the Burnout series, which in turn was owned by camera company Canon, Fiendish tries to reinvent the idea of the budget game by keeping the quality of the games low but moving distribution online. While the price of $15 per title is much lower than most retail releases, the expectations of gamers has grown since the early 80s, and just like in the early 80s, re-releases of full-price games have filled that lower price category. So just so you understand, and this wasn't really a trend in Germany or a trend in North America. But it's a huge trend in countries like the UK and Spain and so forth. You had these budget lines, companies like Codemasters, for example, and Mastertronic that would be releasing very, very cheap games, usually programmed by teenagers, for $1.99, £3.99. So for, let's say, $5 to $10 US at the time, you got a brand new game. It wasn't a re-release of some older title. It was a brand new game. It didn't have to be the best game in the world, but considering that you could probably pick up one of these every week or every 2 weeks, for the weekend or for the week, it was going to tide you over. And they were producing them at such a speed that you didn't really need or fear running out of these budget titles. And they're trying to revive that concept, fresh new budget titles at a low price, you download them, 3D engine, blah, blah, blah. And unfortunately, though, they're competing against, at $15 at this point, you'd be able to go into a software store and buy maybe a 5 or 6 year old PC title. You can pick up the old Wing Commander titles for the same amount on a disc, on a CD. And by comparison, these new games were utter garbage. They were poorly paced, poorly balanced, didn't play well. There was no point to them.
Okay.
Yeah, and I remember there was at least one was a racing game. I thought, oh, cool, fun little racing game. Arcade racy games were getting harder and harder to find on the PC at this point. And yeah, it was unplayable drivel, unfortunately.
Well, but it didn't set back your budget a whole lot, so...
Especially since I didn't pay for it. Okay.
Ah, okay. It was a gift. I see.
Yeah.
Anyhow, AMD, let's move on, because... Yeah. Anyhow, AMD launches the first 1 gigahertz chip.
At a modest $1,299 a chip, AMD's new 1 gigahertz chip will first be shipped in the new compact Presario machines. Intel would soon follow with their own 1 gigahertz chip. And yeah, this was basically the gigahertz barrier had been broken.
Wow. Was it actually a big barrier?
It was a symbolic barrier. I mean, it didn't really make that much of a difference to most games. But this war between AMD and Intel at the time for faster and faster clock speeds was a real battle. I mean, they were fighting also on other fronts. We had the whole MMX thing where they certain features wouldn't work or would work, and there were light incompatibilities between the chips.
Yeah.
Quake famously wouldn't run properly on certain chips.
Yeah.
And that was still driving a lot of the gaming at the time. But at the same time, 3D accelerators were kind of making this CPU craze less and less relevant.
Yeah.
So, yeah, it was a huge deal that they beat the 1 gigahertz, but very quickly it was all going to be about the 3D cards. So it's going to be another 5 years transition period. So you're still going to be worried about your CPU clock speed, but very, very quickly we're going to see that the GPU becomes the driver of the games, not the main CPU.
Right. Also, not much later, you'll get those multi-core processors, and so the clock speed becomes more and more irrelevant.
And yeah, and the Pentium 2 was already a multi-core processor, and every subsequent, or was it the Pentium 3? I can't remember. Either Pentium 2 or Pentium 3 was a multi-core. And after that, that idea of the parallel processing and the multiple cores, which really, thanks to Windows, becomes, I don't want to say practical, but essential, or becomes more, meaningful, really takes off. Yeah.
Well, AMD and Intel were in a competition, and also Napster gets competition.
Nullsoft, the makers of the popular MP3 player Winamp and infamous Llama enthusiasts, now owned by AOL, have released a file-sharing program meant to compete with Napster called Gnutella. AOL...
Really?
Yeah, Gnutella. AOL, which had just merged with Time Warner in January of 2000, quickly shut the project down, no doubt dissuaded due to Time Warner's substantial music industry presence. Gnutella would go on to become the core tech in many peer-to-peer applications, many still being used to this day. So you probably never heard of Gnutella, considering your reaction.
No.
Okay. This became the main peer-to-peer file sharing protocol.
Okay.
And what happened was that they were testing it over AOL. So AOL members, as far as I understand it, could download it and test it. And then when AOL shut the project down, well, the software was out there. And unlike things like Napster, where everything had to be coordinated by Napster's central server, so if you shut down Napster, you shut down the network, Gnutella had no central server. So it spidered out. So it was a decentralized system where if you started looking for files, the only thing you needed was one other active computer on the network. If you had any one computer, you logged onto that other person's computer, their IP address or whatever, and then you would download all the known IP addresses they had on their computer. And then you would ping all of those people, and then you get their IP addresses. And so as long as you had this active list of IP addresses, as long as one person was on, you'd get more IP addresses to keep trying.
Okay.
And your computer would just build this massive catalog of IP addresses that you could always keep pinging through until you got somebody. And if 10 people had the same file, you would start downloading different pieces of that file from different people all simultaneously. So you didn't start downloading the first bit of the file and then the second bit. You would start downloading the first, the fifth, the 10th, and the 12th all at the same time, but from 4 different people.
Okay.
And yeah.
Doesn't that enable piracy or make piracy way easier?
Oh, yes, it does. Yes, it does. But It was also a solution to a problem at the time, which was that the rate at which people were downloading stuff was increasing faster than a lot of companies could upgrade their servers to deal with the download capacity or with the file servicing. So you had a lot of companies who were just, you would go to download a patch for a program or a demo of something or a video file. Remember, this is all pre-YouTube. And you would have to wait for forever for the file, not because the connection was so slow, but just because the server was overloaded.
Yeah, okay.
And these issues of overload, everybody was looking for how do we solve this problem? And decentralizing the download was one of the ways to do this. Because if you're sitting at home and let's say you've already downloaded the first third of the file, and the main server is clogged up, well, your download speed, so the download part of your connection is busy trying to download, but your upload section is completely empty. So you basically had this entire section of your internet connection that was just sitting there idle.
Yeah.
Well, if you could use that to help somebody else get part of the file, the part that you've already downloaded, well, that solves part of your problem.
Right.
And so everybody helps everybody, and it didn't cost you anything more because it's not interfering with your download. And the only problem is, of course, that once you open up this Pandora's box, you've opened up this Pandora's box. And so the Nutella protocol, if you will, or API, I'm not technically versed well enough to know what it is in that regard, but this program becomes the basis of things like LimeWire, which go on for forever. And I remember using this right when it came out. I remember the program was going around all over the place, and we were experimenting with it to see, well, what do you do? And there were websites popping up constantly with text files that had, quote unquote, valid IP addresses of users. And you would just do searches.
Jesus.
You would just put in searches and see what people had on their share folder. Because you would say which folders you want to share, and you'd look and see what do they have, and you'd find not just MP3 files for music, you'd find movie files and everything else. I remember one of the first things we downloaded was somebody had converted the entire movie 2001: A Space Odyssey into a video file that was just 1 pixel.
Why?
So they reduced the because it's such a visual movie, and the opening scene alone is this very slow, sunrise. So it starts out completely black, and then you just see the 1 pixel. Obviously, if you opened it up full screen, it would be the whole screen, but it would just slowly become white, and then it turned red, and there's no sound. It was just that 1 pixel. And it was like, okay, that's pretty cool. And it was just weird stuff like that. I mean, and you're just looking through, and this idea of all the stuff people had suddenly being available to everybody else. It was liberating in a way that we had never seen before.
Yeah.
I mean, it's basically what YouTube is today. So, you'd go on somebody's thing, and in their share file was all the fanfic they had written as text files. Or it was, some fake movie posters that they had put together. Or all the CDs.
Actually movies and some actually music that they have no right to share, but whatever.
And that too. But that was the whole thing, that suddenly it was all there. And we didn't really know what the limits of this were. You didn't know really what was going on with it. And in a day and age when most of your access to music and movies was limited to what was in the local record shop, what was in the local video store, this was revolutionary.
Sure.
You know, if I still remember, this movie, I've never heard of this movie before. You'd find it and it's like, I have no idea what this is, because you didn't know that it existed. You had never seen it on TV. You'd never seen it at the video store, and this guy's got a copy. Cool. And so Nutella was a game changer. Really was a game changer. And kind of made the idea of music as a service, which David Bowie was already not promoting as a good thing, but just admitting that this was the future. And we have it today with our Prime Video streaming and all the other, and Spotify and whatever other apps. It kind of has its fundamentals here.
Okay.
So, yeah. Okay, but that's enough of the tirade. And because we have a tradition here at the Video Game Newsroom Time Machine.
Oh yeah, and I specifically asked for it to be our last topic for today. Babylon 5, finally dead.
After the collapse of Sierra, we reported back in our January episode that the Babylon 5 license, which Sierra had invested heavily into, was up for grabs. Well, it turns out that Codemasters, which had taken over the original Sierra offices in Oakhurst, had also taken over the project, but now, after assessing the situation, it has finally been put to rest. Lead designer Ken Prue told PC Zone that he thought, quote, that a huge mistake has been made, unquote. Fans like me would never get a Babylon 5 game, and the original cast footage recorded for the game would sadly be lost forever. Yes, so it's not a company coming to an end, but yes, a game has been pronounced dead. We hang our heads in sadness. You never watched Babylon 5, the TV show, did you?
Mm-mm.
Oh, you're missing out. You're missing out. Some of the best storytelling and some of the most, product of their age special effects ever. But it's, J. Michael Straczynski's storytelling is top notch.
Okay.
The idea was it was going to be a 5-season television show, and they literally tell you how the show is going to end in the first episode. And then it's about the journey there. And it's this big space opera with political factions, and you follow these characters, and they have amazing story arcs because they were planned out properly from beginning to end.
So you say I should give it a try.
You should definitely give it a try. The only downside to the series is, again, the special effects. They were going for this giant feel with no budget, so they did a lot with. It was the first show to do CGI spaceships and stuff.
Oh, okay.
It looks a little rough nowadays, but it does have that scope. And some of the designs look a little flaky, but when you really get into them, they work because they truly are alien. Watch it. The only downside is this, that they were actually canceled at the end of the 4th season. And so they kind of rushed an end to the 4th season, and they filmed the final episode. And then in the last minute, they got an extension. So the actual 5th season, it feels tacked on. So just watch seasons 1 through 4, and then watch the final episode of season 5, which was really the final episode of season 4. And then you've got the series, and then you can go back and watch season 5 if you want. But it's phenomenal as far as storytelling and characters and arcs, and there's some stuff from the last episode There's one scene in particular, one character's death that I've watched it probably 3 times. Every time I watch it, I tear up. It's so good. So yeah, I can't give away anything more than that. Just Babylon 5, really good. The game could have been phenomenal, but alas, the show had already ended several years before this, and so. So sad. They did a couple more TV movies after that, and there was one short-lived follow-up series, but they're fun to watch, but not necessary.
Okay.
Just remember, there's 2 questions in the universe. What do you want, and who are you? Okay, sorry. Okay. Enough about that.
It becomes way too philosophical for this time of the day, but
it is.
Those are really interesting questions, and now when I think about them, I'm getting a little bit frightened because I can't answer either of them.
And the answers to those will determine a lot. Again, the entire series revolves around those 2 questions. So good. Sorry, now I'm thinking about the show. It's so good. Okay, but we have been recording for way too long. It is now currently exactly 12:08 a.m. We need to shut down. So, any final thoughts before we say goodbye to our listeners?
Actually, I want to end with your praise of Babylon 5. I think this is a good end to this month's podcast.
Perfect. Then that's how we're going to end it. Remember, everybody, like and subscribe. You can like us on our YouTube feed. You can like us on your podcast app. It really does help. We got a big boost from Mads promoting us on Retro Asylum. Really, really thank you. We're averaging about 100 downloads per episode. We'd like to get that up a little bit higher. So if you're in any position to just tell people about the show, we'd appreciate that. Follow us on Twitter. A couple of retweets here and there never really hurt. We really just want to get the show out to more people. We're not making money off of this. We do it out of passion for the subject matter. And I really do want this approach to the history of the industry to hopefully resonate with some people who might otherwise find a 2-hour thing about one topic a little too boring, and just come along on the ride. It's a 10-year journey. You get your little fix every month, and in between there's some interviews. Okay? Cool. With that being said, have fun. Oh, and
bye.
Wait, we need to give a secret
Not yet.
word. We
Stay
need
here.
A secret word. Do you have a secret word?
Nolibab.
What?
That's Babylon spelled backwards.
A real word. Come on.
Jeez. You're asking me
I
questions
got one.
10 past. Go for it.
Gazpacho soup.
Gazpacho soup.
Okay? Tweet that to us. That way we know you made it to the end of the show. Okay, and I just pointed at the screen for no reason, as if somebody could see that. Okay. Okay, man. Hey, have fun. Don't do anything I wouldn't do. And remember, everybody, stay safe.